When did your "something is very wrong here" feeling turn out to be true? Airplane pilot here. Warning, do not continue reading if flying makes you uneasy. One day we loaded up passengers and cargo and everything, and we were ready to taxi. I noticed that the nose of the airplane seemed to be higher up than usual while we were sitting on the ground. I told my first officer about it and he agreed. We double-checked the weight and balance and everything seemed to be right. I decided to just taxi out towards the runway and see if the wheel struts would go back to their normal positions during taxi. They didn't. Still felt weird to me. Something wasn't right. I told the ground control we needed to go back to the gate. Called ops and told them we're headed back because I think something isn't right with the weight and balance. After we get back, I asked them to check how much ballast we have in the aircraft. It's verified on my sheet as 500 pounds, but I have a feeling. Turns out, yep, they forgot to put it in the plane. So had we taken off, the center of gravity would have been out of whack, way past limits. It could have resulted in an airplane that was impossible to control, just like that 747 that took off and had the load slide to the back. That was a day that I was really pleased that I had so much experience flying to give me that feeling, and that feeling could very well have saved my life along with others. Edit. A lot of people are asking how 500 pounds could be an issue on a large aircraft. Not all airliners are that big. The incident I'm talking about in particular was on equipment with less than 40 passenger seats. Evidently, that 747 crash was due to the load shifting and breaking the elevator control mechanism, not the actual load shift itself as I previously thought. To a good weight and balance lesson for small aircraft that explains why aircraft need to be within the weight and balance limits. It might also help some understand why 500 pounds can make a big difference when it's placed in a particular spot on an aircraft. Story 2. Went for a weekend away with a group from my local scouting area back in the 80s. I didn't know them all. Went to make up the numbers and get some climbing/canoeing/caving done. We stayed in a rented house in the Peak District, UK. One evening, a few guys went out to try bouldering, climbing boulders 10 to 15 meters high. I got there, took one look and said no. We have no climbing gear, that's high enough to die falling from. I got the mickey taken, chicken, etc. So I left them to it and walked back. An hour later, one guy fell 10 meters and split his skull open on the rocks below. Killed instantly. Edit. Well, I didn't expect this to get so much attention. For those that asked, I can't remember exactly where it was now. It was over 30 years ago, and I remember at the time it was difficult to find the house, especially in the days before sat-nav and mobile phones. It was down several windy country roads and then up a farm track. It was many years before I visited the area again and couldn't find the place at all. Not even sure I was on the right road. I can seem to remember it was near Castleton, as I think it was the town I walked down to after returning back to the house. And again, for those who asked, apart from one guy who I saw a few times over the years, I didn't see any of the others again. I wasn't called to the inquest, and the group were outside of my normal group of mates. Story 3. I posted this to a Ask Reddit before, but thought it appropriate again. We had a serial killer in SC a couple years ago. No one knew what he looked like yet, but he had already killed 3 people at this point. Well, my granny has lived alone since my pawpaw passed about 15 years ago. She lives at the end of a long dirt road with about 10 other families, but the closest one was about a quarter mile up the road. One afternoon, some random guy comes knocking on the front door of her house. My granny is a practical woman. She's never been to school because she grew up on a farm and was expected to pull her weight, but she is a smart woman. She goes to the door but doesn't open it. Glass door. The 40-ish-year-old man is there asking if he can use the phone since his car broke down. Granny doesn't like the look of this guy. If he doesn't live here, there's no reason for him to be on this road, and if he was visiting someone, their house or anyone else's house would have been closer since she lives in a dead end. Anyways, she tells him that no, he can't use the phone and needs to leave. She backs up and picks up my pawpaw's 410 as she goes. Once he sees the shotgun, he hightails it out of there. About a week later, the cops finally catch the serial killer, and lo and behold, if it isn't the same damn man. That's some pretty heads-up thinking, like in the heat of the moment like that. Good for you, Nanny. I probably would have been tempted to do the Good Samaritan thing and let him in the house, and I probably would have been another victim. So, yeah, thank goodness there's smarter people than I out there like Granny to put these guys in their place. Story 4. This happened almost 30 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was probably 8 or 9 at the time and had been at the store buying candy for the weekend with the girl from next door. She was 1 year younger than me. A car stopped and the man inside opened the passenger door and asked me and my friend to get in the car. He He was picking us up for our parents, he told us. I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong and remember thinking, is this what my parents were talking about? I grabbed my friend's hand, said that we lived in that house, quote, right over there, and pulled my friend with me. Went to their door, rang the bell, went straight in, and told the people living there what had happened. Turns out I was right. We were about to be kidnapped. Story 5. My parents went out for a nice dinner for their anniversary and decided that I was old enough and responsible enough to be left alone for a few hours on a weeknight. I was almost 9 and we owned a fairly protective dog at the time, so it all seemed fine. They leave, tell me to lock up and to call if anything happens. I do so and proceed to party around the house like a rock star. 'Cause dude, I had the whole dang house to myself and I could do whatever I wanted. Hell to the yeah. Halfway through a Sailor Moon marathon, I get a knock on the door. I'm confused as all get out because it's only been about 2 hours and they said they probably wouldn't be back until around 10 anyway. I guess Mama's left something she needed again and swung by to grab it. My front door is a system of 2 doors. A super old, thick wooden door. The house was originally built in the 30s and this door is still the original piece. And then the outside of that, at the time, a screen door. My dog is raising hell at the front door, but I just pull her back to calm down, 'cause she had a tendency to be reactive to most noises. Well, it's not my mom at the door. Some middle-aged man I've never met before in my life. Puppo is now basically feral, so I keep the screen door firmly closed and a hand on her collar as I ask the man what he wants. He starts in on this weird convoluted story about how he has 2 young twin daughters and how they got into a fight and that one of them ran away. Now this man claims that he believes his daughter is hiding in my house and would like to come look for her. I tell him no such girl is here and why does he think she would be here in the first place? He goes on into a long story about how this was the house they first lived in and how it's the one she was born in and how it was like a safe place for her and would be the most likely place she would run away to as it was really the only other place she knows. So I felt kind of weird since I opened the door and this dude's story hasn't been helping his cause, but now I know something crappy is going down. I, in no uncertain terms, inform the guy that he must have the wrong house because this house was built and has been lived in by my family since its construction. My dad was born in that house, and after my mom and dad told his parents that they were pregnant with my older sister, they gave it to them as a present to begin their family. He must be mistaken, because I know all this to be a fact. Hell, there were pictures less than 10 feet away from me on the wall of my dad and uncle playing in the front yard in the late 70s. By now, my dog is growling like crazy and dude is getting kinda agitated. He insists that I don't know what I'm talking about and that if I would just give him a few minutes to search for his daughter, he could be on his way. The latch on the screen door was broken and I was putting all my strength at the time and holding my dog from the door. He opens the screen door with one hand and with the other reaches for my closest arm. My crazy cocker goes effing ballistic, uses all her strength to lunge at him, gets a hold of his hand and bites down. Now the man is yelling and confused. He pushes back against the screen door and slams it shut to get my dog off of him. Sadie gets pushed back indoors but is still raging. I quickly slam the front door, lock it, and chain it shut. Run around the house and make sure all the other doors and windows are locked, and then hunker down in the bathroom hyperventilating and wait about 15 minutes till Sadie's growling has calmed some. Check outside, no man or his car, both long gone. I call my parents and tell them that they need to come home right now, please. When they got home, I recount the whole story. Dad goes to check the front door, and sure enough, on the screen door jamb and siding of the house is a large smear of blood. Sadie was treated like a queen and got a whole steak for her to eat on that weekend. Okay, I know that we do kind of crazy things in the heat of the moment, but why would you go hunker down for 15 minutes and then when you finally do pick up the phone, instead of calling the police like you should have done 15 minutes ago, you call your parents and tell them to come home? You don't know if this guy is gone for sure. Like I don't know. I don't get it. Glad you got out of that okay, but man, call the frickin' cops. Story 6. I work at a psych hospital. I was in the cafe with an adult unit, and the adolescent unit was also there. I had known one of the kids from when she was on the children's, and normally we had a good rapport. I went to say hi and told her I was proud she had been staying out of trouble. A few of the other girls reacted weirdly to me saying it, and the girl looked guilty. I told the staff on the unit, and they said they should keep an extra eye on the girls because I had bad vibes about it. The staff kind of brushed me off. A half hour later, 4 girls, including the one I knew, literally almost killed the 2 staff. One got her head bashed in and suffered brain trauma, and the other staff was blinded in one eye. Story 7. Not me, but my mom. When I was about 10 years old, I got invited to spend the night at my really good friend's home. My mom said no. I begged her to let me go, but she was adamant that I couldn't. She said she just didn't feel right about it and that no amount of pleading was going to change her mind. A few weeks later, my friend's dad was arrested for child-adult content. After he went viral, it was found that he had also SA'd several young girls. He would have his daughter invite them over for a slumber party and then touch them when they went to sleep. If my mom hadn't trusted her gut feeling, I could have been one of his victims. Story 8. It was 1:30 a.m., raining. I was riding my motorcycle down a 4-lane road, 2 lanes in each direction with a middle turn lane. I saw a car approach a stop sign, perpendicular to me, in the parking lot of a bar, and thought to myself, he's going to turn left in front of me. I was going 45 mph, let off the throttle, and about 200 to 250 feet from him, he did exactly what I thought he was going to do. Grabbed my front and rear brakes, back tire locked up, and kicked out to the left. I had maybe 40 to 50 feet in which I would either high side in front of the car and likely be ran over, slam into the driver door or rear driver door, or jump to the right in a tuck and roll fashion. I jumped, and my motorcycle slammed into the rear driver side of his car. I had a couple scratches, bruises, and a sore tailbone, but I wasn't ran over or hanging out in his back seat via glass window. Thank God for spidey senses. Story 9. The following is reposted from an earlier thread, but it's even more relevant here. A former coworker, Jason, told me this story. Jason was working at a dock in China that looked something like this, and uploaded shipping containers from huge international cargo ships. A typhoon had just passed, and many of the inbound ships had been delayed for days due to the extreme weather. Once the weather cleared, there was a blocking of ships waiting to be docked and unloaded. To make matters worse, a tropical depression had just been upgraded to a tropical storm and was expected to make landfall within 48 hours. It was organized chaos as the dock workers frantically tried to unload 3 times the volume of shipping containers in half the time. Jason was a senior cargo agent, and his job was to verify that the information on the offloaded shipping containers matched the information on the manifest, and to visually inspect shipping containers for damage. A cargo agent had to sign off on all cargo before an unloaded ship could disembark. As there were a limited number of spaces for ships to dock, it was crucial that the cargo agents verify the unloaded shipments as quickly as possible so that another ship could dock immediately. Everyone at the dock had walkie-talkies, handheld portable 2-way radios, and Jason heard Dock Manager 1 going absolutely ape-crap because an unloaded ship had been waiting in the dock for nearly 2 hours, and no cargo agent had verified their delivery. Jason radioed Cargo Agent 1 assigned to that area, but there was no answer. He then radioed Cargo Agent 2 and still received no response. He then radioed the next closest Senior Cargo Agent 1 and asked him to drop everything and verify the cargo immediately. After 30 minutes, Dock Manager 2 radioed that the ship was still docked. Jason then radioed Senior Cargo Agent 1, who he had sent over there, and did not receive a response. He then radioed Dock Manager 1, who had been screaming into the radio, and again received no response. Jason was now the only senior cargo agent in the area, and it now fell to him to verify the unloaded shipment and get the delayed ship out of port ASAP. As he got into his truck to drive over, a nagging feeling of dread kept telling him not to go. He ignored the feeling and drove there anyway, all the while trying and failing to radio anyone else in the area. When he arrived at the unloading zone, he couldn't bring himself to get out of the truck, and later said that it felt as if he was being physically pushed back into his seat. Jason then picked up his radio with a shaking hand and broadcast, "Unknown threat near unloading section 4. All workers evacuate immediately. This is not a drill." And just like that, a multi-billion-dollar port was shut down. A hazmat team was soon dispatched and found that a shipping container damaged in transit had been carrying heavier than air inert gas. The gas leaked and displaced the air, then became trapped between several rows of closely stacked shipping containers. Every person that approached immediately lost consciousness. 5 people were found dead near the damaged container, and Jason was later fired because he did not actually have the authority to shut down the port. Jason filed the Chinese equivalent of a wrongful termination lawsuit, but was strongly encouraged to settle, or else the Chinese government might find him partially responsible for the workers' deaths. As a white foreigner in China, this was a very real possibility, and he ended up settling for a modest amount. Jason still blames himself for the death of Senior Cargo Agent 1 and gave the settlement amount to the man's widow. Story 10. I used to be a lifeguard in a very small gated community with a lot of wealthy people. I also used to sing at the local church services. I met the pastor in that context, and something about him just seemed off. It wasn't anything I'd be able to articulate. I just didn't like him. He just made my gut drop. Later, I noticed that the local pastor was spending a lot of time at the pool watching the little kids swim. One little boy in particular. He would have a towel ready for him. He'd have the kid sit on his lap to dry off. As far as I knew, he wasn't babysitting him. He was just there, watching and touching. It made my hackles rise. I told his parents that the way the pastor was interacting with their son made me uncomfortable. They investigated, and it turns out the pastor was going to their home when they weren't there and, quote, spending time with that little boy in his bedroom. They didn't give me any more details than that, but it was implied that something sexual had been going on. I don't know what happened to him after that, but he was obviously removed as pastor from the church. It's so important to trust your gut on these things. Story 11. At a research institute, I walked into a mouse procedure/surgery room for a quick moment to grab something and leave. After walking out, I felt, well, to be honest, like I was a little high. There were 3 other people in that room, including 2 undergraduates, so I got worried and went back inside to check things out. When I got back inside, I asked if they were feeling okay. One of the undergrads turned to me and said she was fine, but was flushed and looked a little out of it. So I went around to all the isoflurane chambers, odorless volatile liquid that KOs mammals at low doses and kills them at higher, looking for leaks. Sure enough, the gasket at the bottom of one of the chambers had failed, and it was leaking out and immediately boiling into a gas and filling the room. I told them their isoflurane was leaking, and the postdoc told me they were fine and that he uses that machine all the time. He also pointed out that the isoflurane was an air-contained biosafety cabinet, and so even with the leak, they were protected. I called him an idiot, because a biosafety cabinet recirculates air and doesn't evacuate it like a fume hood, which is what he should have been using. So I ignored him, propped open the door, and ordered the undergrads to get out of the room. I then went to grab their manager and told her what I had found. Their lab manager came down like the wrath of God. Smiley face. Story 12. My father started publicly dating a woman shortly after my mother died. I later learned she's likely the woman he'd been having an affair with before she died. I liked her. One evening, my father took me to one side and asked how I'd feel about him asking her to marry him. I got an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach and felt nauseated. I told my father I didn't want him to, and he asked why, as he thought I liked her. I explained that he did like her, but had a bad feeling, and he said, quote, "That's just a feeling. They don't mean anything." He already had the ring and proposed straight away. I got really excited about the engagement, the wedding, moving house, and my impending little sister. After the wedding, she changed. After my half-sister was born, she went bat crap. She abused myself, my full sister, my mother's child, and later my half-sister, her own child. He only left her when my doctor told him something was clearly wrong with her that was affecting my health. She was putting a substance that I'm intolerant to in my food, and my father wouldn't believe me and would force me to eat whatever she made. However, I couldn't get a doctor alone without her to tell them. And my maternal grandmother told him that if he didn't leave her, she'd go for custody, that he finally left her. He accused me of lying for the entire time leading up to that and has never asked me about any of my attempts to get help since. Edit. I've gotten to the point of not knowing if my replies are disappearing or if it's the same question being asked by a different person. Tomorrow's the last anniversary of my mother's death before I hit the age she was when she died, and I have plans with a friend this evening because I've been dreading tomorrow, my next birthday, the day I hit her age in days, and Halloween 2018 for ages. FAQs. I was 8 when my mother died, 10 when they were married, 12 when we left. Sister was 3 when our mother died. Our mother died of an aneurysm. Survived the first one, but had a second in hospital. Half-sister is at university studying medicine. Social services were involved at points and made things worse. I waited until she was 18 to get counseling to avoid her going through that again. The access case was an issue, and stepmom told toddler half-sister if she spent the night at ours, stepmom would die, so she eventually stopped coming at all. Stepmom accused me of abusing half-sister in the access case. I was terrified of going near that baby. Shortest example, I smiled. Stepmom freaked out that I have an evil smile, picked up half-sister, and fled from the room. I don't know if half-sister would welcome an attempt to start a relationship. Stepmom married again, beyond reproductive age, no idea if she already had kids. I gave my father a letter 9 years ago saying I'd have nothing to do with him until he put in writing that he'd never use violence or threats of violence against me again. Still waiting. Abusers can be very charming. They wouldn't get anyone in a position to abuse them otherwise. They can be very capable of putting up a facade for people like social services, teachers, coworkers. I would agree my father's an idiot, but he lacks the depth, warmth, and capacity. Edit 2. Oh, and it's citric acid. The intolerance runs on my mother's side, but my sister didn't get it, so it was safe for everyone else. I can smell if an orange has been opened in a room within a couple of hours and taste orange, pineapple, and lemon juice in smaller quantities than normal people. I was diagnosed before I can remember. Apparently, 100 milliliters of orange squash took me out for weeks. My father may not have been aware it was in some things, but he knew it was in at least one thing she regularly served, as it had chunks of oranges that he told me to eat around, even though the whole thing was clearly marinated in orange juice. My gran took us camping annually. We never left in a hurry. No campers I know of disappeared. Story 13. I got off the subway at night. There was one other person about half a block behind me on my route home. This is a totally normal thing, has happened thousands of times. Totally normal looking dude, not even following me closely. I had a bad feeling. Such a bad feeling that when I turned the corner on my way home, I broke into a dead sprint and hid behind a dumpster in the shadows partway down the street. By the time he came around the corner, I was well hidden and could see him from my hiding place. As soon as I saw his reaction to the fact that I wasn't there, I knew I'd been right to hide. He started looking for me, muttering to himself. He went up and down the street, looked around corners. I hid and held my breath until he was gone. It was terrifying. I'm so glad I had that sudden, inexplicable impulse to hide and listen to it. Story 14. My sister was 18 years old and bought a horse from a guy who was married and 47. My parents liked the guy and became friends with him and his wife. I knew something was up because he and my sister would talk constantly on the phone. My mom actually asked his wife if that was cool, and she said it was totally fine, and he did this a lot with other kids who needed horse advice. Yeah. My parents wanted to send my sister to stay with this guy for a whole summer so she could ride and show horses. I told them the relationship was clearly inappropriate and not to do it. They were like, if the wife doesn't mind, then who cares? Within 2 months, he had left his wife. Within 4 months, they were engaged. 4 months after that, they got married. And 1 week after that, my sister was pregnant. This guy has had many parents accuse him of being a predator and coming on to their underage daughters. His own son has nothing to do with him. And he's not even good looking or rich. Just a gross, hideous hillbilly with leather for skin and 3 teeth. Good job, baby sis. Edit. I really don't want to argue semantics about predatorphilia. Dude proposition girls 16 and under. If you're a predator apologist, just don't bother. Story 15. 2 years ago, I was on my way back home on my bike. I had to go over a bridge, and on one side of the bridge, there was a girl crying. On the bridge, 2 14-year-olds, one pretty tall, one pretty small, head to head, seemingly about to get into a fight. When I went by, they stood back. I thought something was off, but I told myself fighting among 14-year-olds over what I thought was a girlfriend is normal and not dangerous, right? Turns out, the taller one of the boys jumped off the bridge to commit self-unaliving only minutes after I passed. The smaller one couldn't physically hold him back. Had I stopped, listened to my gut feeling, I might have been able to help and talk him out of it. Edit. Wow, this got a lot of attention. Some more info then. The kid was bullied and the girl and the other boy were his only friends. Bad family situation too. So he told his friends that he wanted to end it. They came to talk him out of it. They also called the cops and told them to come with sirens off. His friends managed to get him off the bridge, but then the cops arrived with sirens blaring. He ran from his friends and dived headfirst off the bridge. I do not have any issues with what happened. I don't see myself at fault, but sometimes I do think, what if? Story 16. Not me, but my coworker. She got a call last week that her sister-in-law didn't show up for work and didn't call or anything. She's been working 3 jobs recently and was complaining she needed a good night's sleep. Coworker said she probably slept through the alarm clock, but her husband insisted that she go home and check on her because it wasn't like the SIL to just not show up for work. Coworker was annoyed, but did it since her house was only 20 minutes away. Coworker gets there, and it turns out she had overdosed on some sort of opioid and then had a heart attack. Oxygen levels were extremely low, and paramedics said that if coworker hadn't gotten home when she did, SIL would have been dead within minutes. Thank God her husband had felt that something was wrong. Always go with your gut. Edit, if anyone is curious, this happened last Wednesday. Today is Monday, and this morning, they finally let her out of the ICU and into an actual room. Her heart and liver were severely damaged, but it looks like they're on the mend. She had to undergo dialysis yesterday, and it seems to have helped her a lot. They tried to get her to stand up and walk to a chair on Saturday, but it did not go well, and I don't think they've tried again yet. Her speech is a little slower than it used to be, but other than that, it looks like she doesn't have any brain damage. With nobody knowing the timeline of when everything happened, they were very worried that she did some real damage to herself from having such low oxygen for an extended period of time. Once she can finally check out of the hospital, she'll be going to rehab, even though coworker and family believe this is only a one-time thing. Luckily, she lives on the first floor of my coworker's house, so if there are any long-term medical conditions, they'll be around to help her. Story 17. Not me, but my mom, and I'm doing my best to recall the story she mentioned to me a few months ago. My mom has been a psych nurse for over 30 years at a private hospital. One of the patients she was looking after was a very boisterous person in her mid-40s, and she had been in the hospital for over a week. One night, Mom noticed this lady was very lethargic, saying that she was just feeling tired and was going to have an early night, and to get her meds early. This isn't going where you expect. Mom thinks this is very odd for this lady, but everyone has off days, so she gives this lady her medication and she goes off to bed. About 5 minutes passes and Mom still has a knot in her gut about this lady and thinks she will just check her stats. So she goes to her room, where the lady is just about to lay down and checks her blood pressure, pulse, and oxygen saturation. This is pretty rarely done in a psych hospital unless people have other health concerns needing monitoring. This lady's oxygen saturation was down to around 80%, I believe, doing the best to recall. To put it into perspective, if it falls below 92%, your cells can't absorb oxygen, and this can cause permanent damage. Mom, in her over 40 years of nursing, wasn't always a psych nurse, has never seen someone with such a low level. She checks again, and the same result. Mom calls an ambulance and gets this lady on oxygen. Later that night, Mom gets a call from the hospital the patient was sent to, from the doctor who lets Mom know that the lady is fine. She had a blood clot. If she had been left for another 15 minutes, the doctor is certain she would have died. The lady made a full recovery and gave Mom a beautiful scarf the next time she saw her. Story 18. Several years ago on Thanksgiving, my mom was becoming extremely overwhelmed. The holidays have never been a great success in my family, and my parents had issues communicating, which led to a lot of stressful, intense dinners. And if it wasn't them, it was someone else starting a fire. Well, this year was bad. My mom had been cooking for hours to get ready to head over to my cousin's house. My dad was yelling about how we spend too much money on the holidays. It got to a point where my mom told me and my brothers to leave for the party ahead of them. We didn't get far from the house until a really bad feeling started sinking in my stomach. I knew my brothers felt something too. I said, "Can we go back?" And my older brother turned around immediately. When we got there, my father was gone. He had left out of anger, and my mom yelled at him to leave. My mother was in her bed, laying still with an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside her. She was still conscious when we came in, but started shaking and was falling asleep. We called 911. I later learned that the pills she had taken would have only put her to sleep for a long time, not actually kill her, but clearly it was her intent. She had severe depression, and after this, she got some real help. Story 19. Pretty simple one. Went to a party that was just shoulder to shoulder packed from the moment I arrived. I could barely move through the house. People were spilling out onto the lawn and everybody was acting a fool. Way too many people there, and I figured crap was about to go downhill fast. So I grabbed my friend and we bounced. As we were leaving, about 10 to 12 police units passed us on the road headed towards the party. City, county, and state police. Small town, so they probably asked for help. Found out later the party got shut down, obviously, and the police painstakingly ID'd everybody there, arrested everybody involved with throwing the party because of underage drinking, arrested everybody that was underage, found a crapload of drugs and arrested people for that, and ended up towing a crapload of cars because nobody was sober to drive. Even people that were fine to leave didn't get to leave for hours. We just took our asses to a bar and drank like normal adults. So here's a little pro tip for you college age or, maybe high school, teenage, approaching that college age, party age of your life. Never, ever be the last one to leave a party. Pop in, pop out, move on with your night, because if you're there when the cops arrive, you are going down with the ship, buddy. Story 20. My oldest daughter, 30-something, stopped by my work one day and introduced her new boyfriend. He seemed a little off to me, but I decided it was just guy dating my daughter and let it go. Later, he met my wife and I, and she told me later that he seemed off to her too. She had pretty good instincts about people, so we decided to investigate him a bit. Typing his whole name into Google, the first result was a mugshot from a couple of years ago. The third was an active warrant. More searching resulted in finding 3 warrants from different counties, an extensive record, check deception, theft, driving while suspended, driving after a lifetime suspension, and driving while a habitual traffic offender, and a brand new marriage license for him and my daughter. They were going to get married later that week. We, of course, told her about him, but she insisted that he'd already told her about all that and had, quote, taken care of it. We emailed links to her roommate, who showed her, but she didn't have any luck talking her out of the relationship. They were in love, and everything would work out okay in the end. We sent in an anonymous tip, and he was arrested the next day at her apartment. My daughter then found out that he'd been lying to her about pretty much everything. He had entangled her in a business he was trying to start that mostly involved her financing things for him, because his credit was trashed due to records for bounced checks and theft. She's still working to untangle herself from that. He's still in jail, and according to her lawyer, will be for at least 2 years depending on what happens in 2 other counties. Story 21. When I was in university, I was walking home from the bars in the Byward Market in Ottawa with my roommate at the time. It was about 2:30 a.m. and we were looking forward to getting home and ordering some pizza when we came across 2 guys and a very drunk girl. Initially, we didn't think anything about it because it was a pretty common sight on a Friday, but as we walked behind them for a few minutes, we noticed how out of it she was. One of the guys was essentially carrying her, and her clutch was loosely dangling from her limp wrist. Our street came up, but instead of turning down it, we decided to see what was going on. The guys explained that she was one of their girlfriends and had too much to drink, so they were taking her home. We asked them a few more questions. What bar they were at, where she lived, if she was an Ottawa U student, etc. They gave pretty convincing answers, but all the same seemed really uncomfortable and wanted us to go away. During the conversation, the guy holding his girlfriend shifted her position to get a better grip, which caused her arm to dangle down and drop her clutch. Before they could move, my roommate grabbed the clutch and took out her ID. My roommate then asked if they knew her first and last name along with her birthday. This is where things changed. The other guy got really aggressive and confrontational while the other went silent. They didn't know her name or birthday. I then pulled out my phone and called the police. The guy dropped her and they took off running. We waited with her for about 10 minutes until the police and EMS got there. We gave a statement, but did not have much to go on other than their descriptions. Police told us they suspected she'd been dosed, and that she was lucky we happened to be walking behind her. Pretty scary stuff. Story 22. I was climbing and cutting a dead tree, box elder, also known as an ash maple. It was wedged between 2 houses, so I had both neighbors splitting the bill, and they were all out in the yard watching me. The wind was high, and I was moving around a lot in the canopy, about 60 feet up. It was beyond seasick levels of sway, but I'm used to worse. I don't know what it was exactly that was tipping me off subconsciously. Maybe it was something about the sound of the wood creaking that seemed off to me. Maybe when I was climbing, my spurs were making the wrong noise. The wood definitely felt solid. I never hit a mushy spot on the way up. The plan was to top it out and slide down the main stem, lowering limbs with rigging, and then flop the pole nice and neat. Everything seemed routine, but I kept getting goosebumps and it was creeping me out. I wish I could say I had a real clue, but there weren't any signs of trouble. Nothing obvious, but there it was, that horrible feeling of fear. Like that feeling which is so physical it makes you keep questioning your bladder every 5 seconds. I didn't always trust my gut, but having been taught that lesson enough times in life, I tend to go on high alert nowadays, to the point where I'm nearly superstitious. So I just unhooked my lanyards and came down. Justified it by thinking, well, it's probably time for lunch anyway. Wasn't even close. It was like 9 a.m. I gave an excuse, packed up the truck, and went home. I remember I called my old mentor, whose wife had just given birth, just to talk to him and see how things were going. He started talking about his baby, and about how his little brother had been born premature, and they were worried about that happening. Then he rambled off on a tangent, mentioned the time his brother broke his back when a Douglas fir decided to barber chair on him while he was tied in about 20 feet up. Said neither of them saw it coming. Only thing that saved him was quick work on the part of their crane operator. I ate, showered, and having run out of excuses, I finally went back, bucked all the limbs, and cut the top off, but that fear of the barber chair was ripe. I couldn't shake it. So I went the extra step of using my 5/8 line, one of my strongest rigging ropes, holds 26K plus, to marl the base of the trunk up to about 30 feet. It was a massive waste of time, but whatever. Once the quote is accepted, I'm not working hourly, so who cares, right? Effing sure enough, when we went to bring the pole down, it splintered and popped open like it was only being held together by spit and chewing gum. If we hadn't reinforced it with serious mummy wrapping, it would have hospitalized either me or my groundsman, and then done God knows how many tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage to the client's houses. I wish I could say I learned something about tree assessment from that experience, but I didn't. It just gave me one more thing in a long list of examples why I absolutely have to trust my gut and take every precaution I can. I think the vast majority of the data processing our brains do is entirely subconscious, and there's just no way for us to ever make that a conscious process without turning ourselves into autistic savants. So the best we can do is not ignore it. The way it was swaying in the wind, but not with the wind. Holy crap, that didn't occur to me at all. I kept guessing creaking noises might have been the tell, but if you cut a straw from the middle down and then bend it... Story 23. Christmas 2006. My girlfriend and I are at the mall Christmas shopping. I'm of the mind to get my father a watch as he hadn't had one in a while. We literally hit every store in that mall and I couldn't land on one to buy him. Hours spent and nothing. It was about a 45-minute drive home and my GF is frustrated with me. Why couldn't I pick one? What was going on? I pulled the car over and started crying. I couldn't explain it. I don't know why I'm crying and I don't know why I can't pick a watch, but I don't think he's going to be around long enough to use it. Why buy a watch if he doesn't have much time left? Ended up finding one and we had a great Christmas. In the last week of March, 3 months later, he got real sick. Turned out to be a MRSA infection and he passed away March 31st. I walked into his hospital room after the doctors failed to revive him to say goodbye. The watch was on the windowsill and I grabbed it as I walked out, and in the hall I remembered the premonition. Story 24. It was late 2012 at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. A sandstorm blew in, dark and foreboding, across the base. I looked across the airstrip at the new aircraft hangars under construction and could have sworn through the gritty sandy haze that I saw one sway ever so slightly. But I had goggles on. The sand was everywhere, and I was driving a K-loader truck down the runway at the time. I figured I was imagining it, and anyway, I had more important crap to focus on. Next day, I get up and catch my ride to the airfield, and sure enough, that huge steel frame they'd been building for months had collapsed in the night. Just a massive pile of steel beams and sand. Story 25. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place, since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it would be getting quite late. He ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again, and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body and for some reason just turn around and walk away. Freaky story if true. It does sound a bit like a stretch, I'm going to be honest. Too many things falling perfectly into place in order for this to happen. Not saying it's impossible, not saying they're lying. I'm just saying, maybe the truth is being embellished a little bit here. Either way, it made for a good read. Moving on. Story 26. A couple of years back, I got a stomach ache. I'm not normally prone to them, so it felt a little strange. When the pain moved to my side, I knew something was wrong, so I called the doctor, who called me in for an emergency appointment. I was worried it might be appendicitis, and he agreed. I got there, got prodded and poked, and told there was nothing wrong with me. If it really was your appendix, you wouldn't be able to sit there and talk to me. Fair enough, so I went home. Later that night, I start throwing up, so I knew something was wrong. So off to the hospital. The complete female dog of a doctor prodded and poked around again and declared it was just a stomach bug or maybe a urine infection. Told me to drink some flat Coke. What? And go to the doctor in the morning. Bear in mind, I'm so pale as to be actually gray by this point and can barely hold down any more than a couple sips of water. Later in the morning, I'm still not feeling right, so I get my SO to take me to the doctor again. More of the usual prodding and well, it's probably an infection, but I'm going to refer you to the hospital just in case. So I get to the hospital. Long story short, I have a whole bunch of tests, but they're still not convinced it was appendicitis. I was by this point. They eventually agreed to do an appendectomy using keyhole surgery. So I go down for the op, which they reckon will take an hour or so, and don't be surprised if you still have an appendix when you wake up. We're going to have a look first. I woke up about 6 hours later with a 4-inch incision on my side with a tube sticking out of it, rather than the 3 small holes I'd been told to expect. I asked the nurse what the hell happened and got, "Oh yes, your appendix was really bad apparently. I think it burst as they were removing it." So yeah, not only did I have appendicitis like I thought, but I had it really bad. I ended up in the hospital for another week being treated for sepsis. Story 27. Posted before, but when I was doing my PhD, I got offered the chance to go to the Central European University Summer School program to do a course that would have been extremely valuable. I even got offered a full scholarship to do the course, and free accommodation, etc. A truly amazing deal. 2 weeks before I was supposed to leave, I said to my boyfriend at the time, something is telling me I shouldn't go. And I was like, WTF, brain, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. But the don't go feeling kept getting stronger, so I withdrew from the course, feeling stupid for doing it. The day after I was scheduled to leave, my perfectly healthy mom got sick. A week later, she was in a coma. A week later, we had to turn off life support. Her funeral was a week after that. I would have been away during her last waking moments. Story 28. I heard a strange noise when I woke up. I looked outside my bedroom window to see if anything there made that noise and saw my oldest cat sitting on the windowsill outside of the other bedroom. She was staring into the room as if there was something in there that she did not like at all but could not look away. At that moment, I knew there was something or someone in the other room. Then I heard the noise again. It was like a soft squeaking, like someone shifting his weight from one foot to another on a wooden floor. I don't have wooden floors. I told myself there could not be an intruder in that room. It makes no sense that someone could get in there without waking me up, and I gathered my courage and went to check it out. When I got to the doorway, I saw 2 of my other cats in the hallway staring into the other room, very agitated. I peeked around the corner and heard the squeaky noise again. It was one of my neighbor's cats, very afraid and being trapped on my desk by my cats. Story 29. As a young boy, my mom would always get my opinion on a new babysitter and their home, and we would go and meet with them before she would trust them with taking care of me. She took me to meet with a local woman who lived in a trailer home with her husband and 2 daughters to see if it would be a good fit. Even as a young child, about 3, I got really bad vibes from the place, despite everything on the surface seeming clean, normal, and comfortable. I acted like I really enjoyed being there and was looking forward to the new babysitter. There is a portrait of Jesus on the wall. You know what I mean. These are the framed pieces you see at thrift stores all the time. More than anything, it just gave me the creeps. It felt like a warning rather than a welcome. When we got into our car, I immediately started crying. I started screaming at my mom, "I don't want to go here. Please don't make me come here ever again." Why? What's wrong? I just don't like it. I'm not sure on the timeline, but I believe just a few months later, the husband was arrested and sent to prison for SAing both of his daughters. Story 30. Registered nurse here. They pretty much tell us straight off the bat in nursing school to trust our guts. We're allowed to call a rapid response team, people who come when something very bad is happening to a patient, if the patient just doesn't look right to us. I got my job right out of nursing school in a department that deals with mothers and babies right after delivery. I was 22 years old, had no children of my own, and my only experience with newborns was my last 6 months on the job. I had this patient and her baby who both seemed to be doing well. The baby's weight, vital signs, and intake and output were all normal, but I felt like something wasn't right. For one thing, I had never heard this baby cry. Anyone who's ever been anywhere around newborns know that they can pretty much cry at the drop of a hat, for anything, at any time. This baby didn't cry when I put her on the scale to weigh her. They usually cry like you're actively trying to kill them, or when I pricked her heel for a blood sugar. I felt like a total idiot because I had almost no experience with newborns, but I decided to talk to someone anyway. I brought the baby to the nursery nurse, who had over 20 years' experience in the department, and told her that I thought something was up. The baby looked fine. Her vitals, including her blood sugar, were perfectly normal. However, the baby was floppy. Not a technical term, but used to describe a baby when its arms and legs aren't curled up tightly next to the body like they're supposed to be. The baby's arms and legs were limp and stretched out. She had a poor grasp. She didn't tighten her fingers around our fingers like newborns are supposed to do. And when we could get her to cry, we barely could. Her cry was weak. The nursery nurse agreed that something was wrong and called the neonatologist, newborn baby doctor, who was on call that night. She spent about 20 minutes on the phone just trying to tell him that something wasn't right, even though everything was technically normal. Luckily, the neonatologist trusted her judgment and had us send the baby to the NICU. That baby ended up staying in NICU for about a month, being tube-fed because she stopped eating well. They did genetic testing on her and discovered that she had been born with a pretty rare, only 30,000 cases diagnosed annually in the US, genetic disorder that usually isn't diagnosed until the baby is unable to sit up on their own at about 6 months of age. The disorder has no cure, but doctors were able to start treatments on her in order to manage some of the symptoms almost immediately. Story 31. Christmas Day, 2016. My family and I packed the car with all the goods and were about to be on our way to my grandparents' house. The car wouldn't start. Let's back up. The whole day I felt I was in a trance or a dream. I kept feeling off, and the night before I had a dream that we were driving on a bridge, our tire popped, we slid, and a car slammed into my side of the vehicle. I remembered it so vividly because I see the headlights coming at me in my head still. I get prophetic dreams a lot, but I really didn't think much of it because I also suffer from nightmares. Anyways, we called AAA. Meanwhile, I'm refusing to get in the car because everything feels off. The guy gets there, tells us it was our battery, so he charged it. I still felt very off, but seeing as he fixed the problem, I get in, he turns around and says to Mom, "I just want to check your tire pressure for some reason." Not kidding. He said one of the front tires was extremely high. Was, and I quote from AAA dude, about to pop if we were to drive, especially on a highway or turnpike. He fixed that too, free of charge. The feeling of being uneasy and dreamlike faded, and I felt fine. Made it to grandparents' house. Awesome mashed potatoes. I know when to trust my gut. Edit. It seems a lot of people are twisted up in the prophetic dreams part. I call them prophetic because I don't know how to explain them. The car crash one was the first to seem like it could have actually been a warning. So I just added that in with my gut to say my gut was right. I don't mean I can see the future, because I don't believe that. I just meant sometimes I get dreams, and when I wake up, I'm in a disassociated state until something about said dream happens. But it's mainly nonchalant things. Nothing like, I saved everyone because of my future seeing dream. Sorry if it sounded like I was almighty, that's so Raven. 2. All I know is that recently, before Christmas, it was either AAA or BJ's, can't remember which time it was, that gave us a new tire due to the previous tire that was there kept deflating and my mom had to add air 2 to 3 times a day. You know, most tire shops and auto body repair shops will plug up a leaking tire and fill it back up for you totally for free on the house, so just throwing that out there. Assuming you didn't run over 20,000 nails and puncture it in multiple access points, it's pretty easy to plug up and they will typically look after you. I've done that several times. Story 32. A few years ago, about 1 a.m. Sunday morning, I had to take my dog out before bed. I live in a rough neighborhood and I'm a female, so I usually have my guard up regardless of the time. Before I left the apartment building, my gut told me something was up. The street was completely void of traffic and people, except for a van parked out to the side of the road. Outside of it were 3 people whom I quickly identified as male. Right away, my reaction is to keep my head low, put my jacket hood up, and not bring attention to myself. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see that they were struggling. On closer inspection, I see 2 of the men are holding up the other man between them. I make the assumption that they're headed home after a night of heavy partying and they're just helping their friend get sick or something. I'm telling myself this to ease my fears. Then they notice me and they stop everything and freeze. I thought that was odd and no good, so I drag my dog straight back to my building. I don't even know if he got the chance to pee that night. I go to bed and thinking nothing more of it, until it's time to take the dog out again in the morning. There was a notice in the elevator asking for witnesses as to exactly what I saw that evening because a dead body had been found. So this wasn't a friend of theirs after all. They were ditching a body. Still upsets me today, and I will never ignore my intuition again. Story 33. I'll throw out an opposite one. This was in the late 1990s. Boarding a flight from Dallas to Denver, TWA, on an MD-80. It's evening. The women behind me are clearly worried about flying, and it's annoying me. So I grab a book and read to distract myself. No electronics on takeoff then, remember? Anyway, we take off, and pretty quickly after we take off, the plane slows down, and the flight attendant gets up from the back and scurries to the front. The ladies behind me are again panicking. That's not normal. And I'm just rolling my eyes. You always slow down a bit after takeoff. My gut says we're cool. Then, after about 2 minutes, the plane executes a really sharp turn and the pilot comes on the announcer. Okay, this isn't normal now. Ladies and gentlemen, we're returning to the airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Quiet for a bit, and then he comes on again to tell us what happened. We lost an engine. This happens all the time. Oh, and you may notice a few emergency vehicles on the runway, but that's just normal procedure. As we land, I see what looks like every single fire truck at DFW lined up beside the runway. We land without major issue. People clap, and then the pilot breaks us the real news. So I've trained for that many times in a simulator, but it's a once-in-a-career experience for a commercial airline pilot. So my gut was wrong. I was sure there was nothing wrong, and there was. Edit. I was trying to look up if there was a log of this incident. It would have been 1998 or maybe 1997 or 1999, I think, and the flight was either DFW to Denver or DFW to St. Louis on TWA. I know for sure we did our abort in the dark because I remember the lights on the fire trucks. So evening flight. Edit. I think this is me. Looks like it was Delta, which means that, if I recall correctly, I was rebooked onto a TWA flight to get to my destination, which I'm sure now was St. Louis. Story 34. I used to own a cat. It was a stray that came to us for food and affection. We've had multiple strays like this, but this one was different. A year after she first came to us, she got hit by a car. We found her and took her inside, which we didn't allow first. She recovered, and you could tell she was so grateful. We had her for another 4 to 5 years until last year. About a year ago, I woke up from a sound outside my window. There's a big farm a bit further up on the street, so it's not unusual for trucks to drive by in the middle of the night. But that day, I had the feeling that this sound wasn't a truck. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night because of this feeling, and the first thing I did the morning after was look outside if I saw something. There was nothing, but all day long, I was stuck with this feeling something was not right. When my dad came home that evening, I asked him if he saw the cat. He did not. About an hour later, he called me and said these exact words. Think we have a problem. That moment I knew. He found the cat in behind our house, hiding from the rain under a metal plate. It couldn't walk anymore, but it still lived. My dad took her to the vet and left it there so they could take some pictures and do some tests. Only 20 minutes after he came home, they called already. It appeared her spine got cut in two, and the bottom part of her body got totally effed up. There was nothing they could do. My dad told me there was nothing I could have done, but only if I had searched better that morning. That it shouldn't have spent that whole day alone in the rain. I feel so guilty for that. I always tell myself I'm a dog person, but damn, I love that cat. I haven't really told this to anyone since it happened, and it feels good to finally share this. And now the obligatory English is not my first language, so be gentle. Sad story, thank you for sharing, and there's nothing wrong with your English. That was very well written, so I hope that you were able to heal from that and move on. But thank you for sharing the story about your cat. Story 35. Growing up, my dad taught my brother and I how to hunt. When I was around 12 or 13, my dad bought us a couple of shotguns as a Christmas present. He got a good deal off a guy whom he heard about through a friend of a friend. This guy was a gun enthusiast with a federal firearms license. Along with his gun hobby, he was an amateur adult film photographer. After buying the shotguns, we wanted to go to a range to shoot them, and this guy actually knew of a public range and asked if we wanted to go shooting. My dad, brother, and I loaded up in the truck to go pick this guy up from his house. On the way, my dad warned us that he was a little strange. We got to his house and went inside. There were cardboard boxes stacked damn near to the ceiling everywhere in his small townhome. His wife was crying and he was yelling at her to shut her mouth. I'm assuming she was upset that he was leaving to go shoot guns when he had a horrible mess at home and a newborn baby. We jumped in the vehicle and headed out towards the range. He was talking a mile a minute about guns, popping strange pills along the way. My brother and I looked at each other and just laughed as he would go on about the weirdest crap. We spent a couple hours at the range and headed home for the day. We just knew that there was something seriously wrong with this guy and decided not to go shooting with him, or even deal with this guy ever again. A few months later, I was on the school library computer and I noticed a familiar face on the news homepage. The same guy had scheduled a photo shoot with a model from Canada, and after some kind of dispute about money, he stabbed her a bunch of times and dumped her body in a creek. Pretty sure he's doing life now. Story 36. This is hyper weird, but as a kid, and much less frequently now as an adult, I had severe deja vu, but not in the traditional sense. It was almost like months or years before the event, I would have a dream, and then after the event or during the event, I would remember the dream I had that was actually about the event that was unfolding. The best example was when my brother got third-degree burns over his body and had to get flown to the Sydney Children's Hospital. Camping at Wangla Dam in our caravan, we were playing Pictionary. My brother was smashing it, and his last attempt was stumping us all. The answer was the TV show Neighbors, and as soon as the answer came out, I remember a dream where the Pictionary answer was Neighbors, but couldn't remember what happened afterwards except that something really bad was about to happen. It was weird because the feeling was so heavy, and then 5 minutes later, the jug falls and the rest is history. I remembered Neighbors so vividly from this dream, like memory, but knew something bad was going to happen because I remembered the feeling of dread associated after. Other examples were when I knew my granddad had passed away, as I had a dream about my mom crying and walking through our front gates, and when I actually saw her crying and coming home, I just knew. The dream came true. The way my young mind rationalized this was that we're living a memory that happens before the event. We've experienced this already, but life has like a delay, similar to radio. Sounds stupid, but it's what I've got. Edit. The burns were from boiling water from a jug. Fire isn't the only way to receive burns. Boiling water is one of the worst, according to the nurses. I also need to point this out. Lots of non-believers have called this out as bullcrap or simply deja vu. I'm a man of science, and yet I can admit that this seems illogical, but that's why I explain through example. It feels more than deja vu, and it involves realizing that you had this future memory and thinking that this or that will happen before it happens based off the memory. Story 37. I grew up in a fairly quiet neighborhood, and when I was 12, we got our first dog. It was my job to take him for a walk every evening after dinner. This dog was the goofiest, sweetest golden retriever mix, not a mean bone in his body. He never met a stranger, and when he would occasionally escape, we usually found him in a neighbor's yard playing with some kids. He was the farthest thing from a guard dog you can imagine. So I'm walking him home one night after dinner by myself, and he suddenly stops dead in his tracks in the very middle of the sidewalk. Out of the trees lining the neighborhood, maybe 10 feet away from me, this guy just comes strolling on out. I was pretty skittish at that age, and I didn't like being alone with strange men, like, at all. So I was immediately unnerved. The guy walked up to me and asked if my dog was friendly. I responded out of sheer anxious panic and said that yeah, he was. The second guy reached out to pet him though. My dog snarled and snapped at his hand, which I had never seen him do before. I apologized, made some excuse I don't remember, and hurried away under the pretense of getting my vicious dog away from him. Turns out, this dude was a SAer who assaulted 3 other neighborhood kids in those trees, and my dog was probably the only reason I wasn't the 4th. Story 38. This was something like 12 years ago. I was around 15 years old. My dad and uncles often chop down trees to cut and sell. Not a native, so I don't know the correct terminology. Basically, they make firewood to sell. None of them does this for a living. They all have other jobs, but since my grandfather did this his whole life, they all know how to do it, and since my family owns some land, they kinda maintain my late granddad's business at some capacity, working mainly at weekends, and it works something like a hobby they all enjoy and get some money out of it. All this to say that even though they know what to do, they're not experts or respect every safety measure. So me and a cousin were with them on the woods one Saturday. She is 1 year younger than me, and my dad and uncles were just getting ready to chop down a huge eucalyptus. They tied the tree with ropes and were cutting it to fall down where near the road. where they had the trucks nearby, to carry it after cutting it in pieces. They told me and my cousin to go furthest into the wood, basically to the opposite side where the tree was going to land. They were about to do it, and I can't explain, but I was getting the sensation of the tree's going to land on us. I started to move and told my cousin to follow. She tells me no, she wants to see the tree getting cut. We start to hear the noises of the chainsaws. They've started it. I tell her I feel the tree is going to hit us. The debate starts and she basically refuses to leave. That her dad told us to be there and they know what to do. Don't be such a pussy. I leave her there and go further away, since I can't shake the feeling that the tree is going to land on that spot. I then decide to come back because I was so sure my cousin was going to get hurt, and the only thing I can think of is stealing her cap to piss her off and she might move. I proceed to do it. It works and she starts to chase me. After less than a minute, the tree falls right on the spot where we were before. The effing tree landed on the opposite side where my dad and uncles intended it to. We then start to hear them screaming because they thought we were hit by it. They come running and saw us both paralyzed, me with a hand still holding her cap. Basically, what happened was, the two ropes broke and the wind was pushing in our direction. And even with the tree being cut towards the other way, it still fell wrong. My dad was almost hit by it as well, since they weren't expecting it. I can't explain it. I don't believe in signs or anything supernatural. I also don't know crap about cutting trees, and to be honest, I don't remember noticing the wind as well. I just felt something in my gut that we weren't safe. The good part is, me and that cousin have a love-hate relationship, and every time I'm about to lose an argument, I go, "Shut up, I saved your life." And sometimes it works. Story 39. My old dog used to throw up every now and then. Sensitive stomach, whatever. I asked the vet about it. He said she was healthy. One night I'm up late, and I come to the kitchen and see some throw up. No big deal. Clean it up. Then I get the sense that I really need to see my dog. So I go find her, and she's a wreck. It's after midnight, and for a second I think she's got the dog flu or some nonsense, and that this will have to wait for the morning. Then I come to my senses, and I see the shape she's in. She's shaking and hunched up, and looks like she just wants to shrink up into her own body and disappear. I think she's dying, and I leap into gear. Turns out she was dying. She ate sago palm, a super common lawn plant around here, also super toxic. We didn't know that, had just planted one, and she had gotten a hold of the other plant and eaten the entire root base. Ironically, eating so much poison is probably what saved her, because it forced her to throw up sooner. As it was, I had to rush her to the emergency vet, and she had to spend 2 nights there. She made a full recovery and had many years of being a happy doggo. We dug up the sago palm, trashed it, and still refused to have it in any yard. Story 40. God, I have so many of these, it's not even funny. My older brother was in his late teens and living with my mom, me, and my younger brother. He'd have his friends over at the house to drink, and the minute I met one of his friends, we'll call D, I felt off. Well, over the next few months, he made sexual comments to me. I was 12 and he was nearly 20. Tried to pull me on his lap and walked into my room at 10 at night and sat on my bed, drunk, rambling with me trapped in the corner for 20 minutes until my brother came in and dragged him out. He later started dating a friend of mine who was 2 years older than me. I found out a few years later after all this that he had done the following. Essayed my friend while they were dating, literally effed a sheep and a donkey, and used a vibrator belonging to the mother of one of his friends. Then, a year and a half ago, he turned up at my mother's house drunk. He drove there, by the way. Asked her for sex. She laughed at him, and he asked her to get me, and he wouldn't leave until she threatened to call the cops. Story 41. American Airlines flight into Miami from Chicago in the early 90s. It had been announced as we left Chicago that the plane was overloaded. As we approached MIA over the Everglades, I noticed that we seemed very far up when the planes waiting to take off became clearly visible. It seemed very wrong. It was dusk. As the plane, 727, passed Perimeter Road and the ground seemed close, the engines, I was third seat from the last one on the right aisle, spun up like we were taking off. I was looking across the middle seat guy out the window past the front of the right engine and could see how the plane's pitch was from the blue lights. The plane pitched up sharply, looked like 30 degrees to me, but that might not be possible. It was a big angle. Half second later, we made contact. 90% of the overhead bins fell open, and the oxygen mask came down, raining big bags and stuff into the aisle and onto some passengers. 5 bin doors fell onto the aisle floor that I saw. LOL, people were grabbing them. As I looked, to my perception, calmly thinking, this is a plane crash, out the window past the guy next to me, who had his hands one on each seat arm attempting to squeeze it to neutron star density, I could see from the lights that the plane had angled up, hit, then bounced in a short arc, hit again, then stayed down. It seemed like keeping it straight was a bigger issue than it usually is. It all got under control, of course, since I'm here. I'm absolutely sure that plane did not turn around and stay in the service planned for it. It needed fixing. Me and the seat arm crusher stood behind everyone waiting to leave. There near us were 2 female flight attendants. It was quite a while. Then I looked at one and asked, how often does this happen? She looked at the other attendant, who looked back, and they both started shaking their heads, and she said, this never happened to me. As we got to the exit door up front, nobody in the cockpit crew was smiling. Story 42. I was sitting on the bus when I had the feeling that someone was watching me. I casually look up and scan around, and sure enough, catch some effing guy staring at me. Great. But it gets worse. All of a sudden, I realize the guy next to me, the guy who's between me and the aisle of the bus, has been staring at me too. I'm starting to get panicky because I'm all alone, and 2 creeps at once is too many to keep track of. Luckily, it's only about 9 p.m., and I'm in a very busy part of town. I just need to get off the bus in a well-lit area. I just went to stand up and stand near the exit of the bus by the driver until my stop arrives. Unfortunately, that means I need to pass the creep in the aisle seat. As I stand up, he makes no motion to adjust for my exit. Sure enough, he's not going to get up. He's not even going to swivel around. I know I'm going to have to squeeze my way past him, and I know he's going to squeeze my ass when I do. And I squeeze past him, and he squeezes my ass. Now I'm creeped out, humiliated, and angry. I'm trying to keep it together and get off the bus as soon as possible. Unfortunately, in my emotional rush, I get off the bus 1 stop too early. I can just see the busy, well-lit streets 1 long block away, but I've gotten off the bus in a dark, empty stretch of sidewalk, and so, to my horror, was the other creepy man on the bus who watched me the entire time. At this point, every alarm bell in my mind is blaring, and I'm desperate to make it to the right, well-lit street. It's only the 1 block, but I can feel his every step next to mine. It doesn't take long for him to make the first move, trying to start a conversation, but I only walk faster and ignore what he's saying. Then he starts to talk again, and wham! He shoulders me hard, in the direction of a dark alley I hadn't seen in the shadows. He starts whispering things, and to this day, I don't remember what he was whispering because I'm screaming and screaming for help, but there's no one around on this block. He starts dragging me into the alley, and at this point, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I gathered up all my strength and punched him as hard as I possibly could right in the face. I was wearing rings, and I think this is why it worked, since my upper body strength isn't much to speak of against a full-grown man. It was enough to get him to release me, and I sprinted, faster than I ever have in my whole life, screaming the whole time for help until I made it to that busy, well-lit street. People were staring at me because I was still screaming and sobbing, but I kept going until I made it home. In some ways, what I remember most was the reaction when I got home. All my male housemates were stunned to hear what happened, but their girlfriends all started talking to me about similar assaults they'd each faced, which only stunned my housemates further. This certainly wasn't my first street harassment, but it was the most serious. The rest of the house was going out to a party, and the last thing I wanted was to be left alone, brooding and scaring myself. But that night, I was pretty quiet, and all my housemates kept a close watch on me to make sure I was okay. Story 40. I went to the wrong funeral once. There are a few locations of a chain funeral home near me, and one right down the street from where I work. A coworker died, and the funeral was held on a Saturday. I drove from home about 30 miles to the funeral home near where I work because I wrongly assumed that's where it would be held. I pull in and the funeral home is packed, standing room only. I don't recognize anyone from work, but amidst the few hundred people, I can't say that it wasn't to be expected. Eventually, they start the eulogy. They close the doors to the chapel, and I'm stuck inside. It's only a few moments into it that I realize that I'm at the wrong place. Not only am I at the wrong funeral, in the wrong funeral home, I'm in the wrong damn city. I sit through it, and when the funeral procession starts, I just stay in the parking lot until I can leave on my own. Story 44. Freshman year, was hanging out with a sort of shut-in who was kind of weird but had no friends and was pretty nice. After a couple of days of hanging out, I started getting an odd feeling but didn't care. Fast forward to day 5. We're half gossip talking about people. She's got crazy negative feelings about people I barely see her talking to. I criticize her for it. She goes mini ballistic, but not enough to trigger the alarms. Next time I show up, I get a bad feeling. Ask to use her bathroom. Find an oldish looking revolver, loaded. Take out all the bullets and hide them in my pocket. Text my friend and say, pull up now. Go back in the room. Miss Shut-In goes to the effing bathroom and returns with the exact same gun. Pretends to be playful with it. I nervously laugh and crap, thinking she's just a careless dumbass. Then she gets a serious look on her face and calmly points the thing at my face from the other side of the room and says, boom, and pulls the effing trigger. Empty though, because I emptied it. My friend is in front and Miracle calls me and I pretend it's some important contact and say, gotta go. Story 45. I was one driving on a highway in the middle of some hills. It was a rather hot summer evening and the sky was, well, just not right. It was tinted with a very bright yellow color, something I had never seen before. As I kept going, everything outside suddenly went pitch black and rain started to fall. I thought I could make it when I saw another car under the bridge, so I decided to stop beside it. Just a few seconds before, a tornado passed right over our heads. I felt the car shaking, and I swear I could feel the rear end lift up. Mind it, mine was a very small car at the time. It was a matter of minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When everything was over, the sky was clear again and it seemed like nothing had happened. But a friend of mine told me that the road on the other side of the hills was covered in fallen trees. And that was only the 3rd time I risked my life. I was lucky to have a bridge to cover under. Story 46. I was an 18-year-old kid working in fast food. I usually worked nights as I was taking college classes. My friend, who was still in high school, also worked at night. She was on register. I was packing orders. It's just before closing. The restaurant is empty except for the manager near the back, a guy doing dishes, and my friend and I at the front. This guy comes in and orders a simple box to go. No big deal. We didn't need to cook anything. I had a meal all packed up before the guy's even done paying, so I turn around and hand it to him. He's speaking to my friend. She apparently gave him the wrong change. She just corrected it and gave him the right bills. Then, oh, your hands are so soft. Do you moisturize? I don't like to stereotype, but this guy looks like he doesn't give a flying F about moisturizing skin regimens. Alarm bells are instantly going off in my head. Then he shows her the bills in his hands. She gave him the wrong change again, and she can't argue. Those are the bills she just handed him, right there in his hands. So she mutters an apology and goes to hand him the correct bills. Again. Around this time, my mom was a manager at Walmart and told stories about this kind of thing all the time. I go in the back to get my GM, who, of course, was making a personal phone call. B, we got a quick change artist. Blank look. What? A quick change artist, B? We got a flim-flammer. Now he gets it. He hangs up and quickly walks up to the front with me just behind him. We get there right as my friend is giving this guy change for a 100, which we're not supposed to do, and guess what? She gave him the wrong change again. Instead of 5 20s, she gave him a 20 and 4 1s, as she could clearly see when she showed her the bills in his hands. All of these transactions took place in between the man's smooth chit-chat. Did you have a good weekend? Oh, look, you gave me 1s instead of 20s. It's okay, it happens. It's probably been a long night for you girls. There was nothing the manager or I could do at this point. Ideally, when this happens, the cashier is supposed to close the drawer, apologize and say it was all their fault, and get a manager to count the drawer. Not that we ever got any training on this. I just happen to know because of my mom. This was so blatant, though. Plus, there's the risk that the guy might just pull out a gun. So the guy sees us and knows we're on to him, so he shuts up. I chuck his chicken tacos across the counter to him and he leaves. The manager locks the door and counts the register. My friend was short $220. The guy wasn't that smooth. My friend was a combination of dumb teenager and slightly high. We watched the tapes after. The guy had it all prepared. We watched my friend hand him back the correct change, which he would slide into his back pocket, move his hand around to his front pocket and bring out a 20 and a few 1s, then show it to her like it was the cash she had just handed him. The worst part was the restaurant made her pay it all back. This, kids, is why you're required to count a customer's change out to them instead of just handing it to them. Edited the bills for math reasons. Story 47. One night, I was about 8. I was hanging out with a bunch of high schoolers for some reason, and we were playing Manhunt. My team went into the woods to hide, where we found a spot to wait for, while we heard a noise that we just dismissed and left. We went back to the edge of the woods to scope out the area. One of the kids told me to wait there, so I did. About 5 minutes later, I had this bad feeling, so I just left. The next day, I went back to that same spot in the woods with my friend to show him. I heard the same noise I heard the night before with the other kids, but again didn't think much of it. We soon got out and started to head home. We were probably 50 feet away from where we had exited the woods when I looked back at my friend. A man emerged from the spot we had. I yelled back to him to run, and when we got a safe distance, I turned back to the man and we just locked eyes for a good minute when he started to approach us, so we ran home. I'm 17 now and think back on it. I always wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in the woods by myself that night before. Story 48. Last year, I had to end a 5-year relationship with my boyfriend/best friend. He had been dealing with very intense depression and anxiety his whole life, and I had been trying for years to get him help. I had recently moved farther away and started going to college, so we didn't see each other as much and were growing apart. Breaking up with him was the hardest decision I ever made, because I still love him very much and I had planned on spending my life with him. I told him that this wasn't the end, that we just needed time to focus on ourselves and get our lives together. I told him I'll still be there for him and continue to get him the help he needs. I had a bad feeling that this might be a catalyst for him to hurt himself or commit self-unaliving, but what more could I do? A week later, he messages me saying he couldn't talk at the moment, but he wanted me to know that I was the best thing that ever happened to him and that he loves me and knows I'll go far in life. This message rubbed me the wrong way, and I instantly felt like something might be wrong. I messaged him back, but he never saw it. I messaged his brother and told him to keep an eye on him for me. 20 minutes later, his mom calls me screaming that he ended himself. He didn't survive. I wasn't surprised when I found out he was dead. For the entirety of my knowing him, he always thought it would end this way. I've made my peace with the fact that there wasn't anything more I could have done because I did my absolute best to help him. I learned that you can't help someone if they don't want help. Miss you every day, Matt. R.I.P. Story 49. In the very early 80s, I was a member of the punk community, and we had a girl named Kathy who had some kind of Radar O'Reilly sense for cops. If we were at some venue or crashed a party, or something where cops might show up, she knew somehow they would be there. I remember 2 instances in particular. The first was a bunch of people had broken into an abandoned movie theater that had been for sale for as long as I could remember. It still had power hookup though, as evidenced by the dimly lit marquee with for sale info. Well, some people decided to hold an impromptu rock concert there, and it was all done by word of mouth, so we got there long after it had started and was getting a little too popular. There were dozens of cars and probably over 1,000 random punks, college kids, and teens like myself. It was pretty crazy. We were in what used to be the theater lobby where the pot smoke was pretty thick and everyone was chatting. In the theater part, some punk band was playing. There was a mosh pit and everyone was slam dancing. It was so loud you could barely hear anyone talk. Suddenly, Kathy gets this blank look on her face and goes, "We gotta go, now." And we knew that look, so we booked it out of there. And as we drove off of the overcrowded parking lot, about 5 to 6 cop cars drove in, sirens and light blaring, blocking off all the exits. No idea what happened after that. Another time was a huge party where some dumbass rich kid came back from college, hosted a huge party, and then everyone found out about it and the house got trashed worse than a house in a John Hughes film. I was in the living room where a bunch of us were snagging expensive liquor along with the theater troupe we were friends with. Kathy was chatting about nothing in particular. Got that look, and she didn't even have to say anything. We just knew. We grabbed what we could and left. We later heard shortly after we left, cops came down and snagged everyone underage they could nab, which would have been me at the time. Huge underage drinking bust, and they were prepared. They had driven in with the paddy wagon and everything. I looked up Kathy on Facebook while writing this, and now she's an art show coordinator and event promoter in Colorado, and probably in her early 50s. She hasn't sold out. Story 50. I was at a barracks party for the first time with my platoon. I was just getting to know them, and I'm really awkward around new people, so I started chugging drinks. We planned on going out to a club, and everyone said they would take care of me if we went out. I'm the only female in the platoon. Outside smoking, I wanted to make it clear that I'm one of the guys and everyone can make dirty jokes because it doesn't bother me. I straight up said, say whatever you want, just don't SA me. Feeling buzzed. We go back inside, I'm feeling good, so I keep drinking these mixed drinks a guy was making. While I'm still conscious, this guy's making flirty eyes at me and almost being mean to me, even though I was just trying to party with my new platoon. Well, I black out and wake up to the same guy that was acting strange naked. I should have seen the signs, but also the people there said they would take care of me. So TLDR, go with your gut feeling and don't rely on seemingly nice people to take care of you. Update. Court-martial ended today with a not guilty verdict. I speculate that 6 out of 10 members voted guilty and 4 said not guilty. In the military, you need 2/3 for a guilty conviction. I was emotional, and so were 3 of the jury members when the verdict was read. A lot of perjury on the stand, that some may not have seen through. I do not regret testifying, but it was a punch in the face when I thought justice was going to be served. He remains in the Army, although he might be barred from reenlistment. Sexual offenders are among our formations. Do not trust your battle buddies. Any further questions about details of trial/process/ the night of alleged incident, please message me directly. I hope I paved the way for justice even if it wasn't served in my specific circumstance. Please come forward with any misconduct. It's your only chance to be heard. I looked my SAer in the eye. He knows that his actions are immoral, wrong, gross, and he got away with it. He will live with that for the rest of his life. Those who lied under oath will live with that, for their lives, if he becomes a repeat offender. Thank you for hearing my story. Story 51. I studied in London this summer with some people, most of whom I didn't know. By the end of our few weeks abroad, though, we were all friends for the most part. One of the last nights there, a bunch of people in the group wanted to go to some club they walked by the other night. Now, I'm not a club goer. Hate the music, hate the atmosphere, hate the dancing, and I don't drink. I don't care if others want to go, just not my scene. I decided, though, I may as well go and see what a club in London would be like. Honestly, I had very little experience of clubs in America, so I figured this would be something new at the least. Anyways, after an hour or so, a couple friend left, and I ended up being the only guy left in the group, and the only one sober. I had already seen several shady guys on the dance floor, and felt that if I left, someone in my group might not make it back home. Despite my friends telling me to leave because I hated the place and that they could watch out for each other, I stayed. Long story short, I was the only one who noticed one of the girls, Sarah, not her name, but whatever, acting odd. We were all by the bar when she came over with some man harassing her. I got between them and stayed next to her until he left. All the girls ran back onto the dance floor, oblivious of what just happened, while I stepped off to the side with Sarah. About 10 minutes later, it became very clear that she had been roofied. Man who roofied her came up to us once I got us out of the club, which took like 5 minutes to walk what would have normally been 30 seconds, and I had to tell him 3 times to F off before he left. The rest of our group came out right as he left. The numbers was probably what scared him off, and insisted we walk out of our way to get McDonald's. They were all still fairly drunk and didn't understand that she couldn't walk on her own. They kept saying we should stay together, but I knew Sarah could barely walk the 10 minutes it takes to get to the bus stop we needed, and McDonald's was like 20 minutes the other way. Since they were a little tipsy, I had to tell them this a lot before they went for food, and me and Sarah went to get home. The 10-minute walk took 30 minutes, and we arrived at the bus stop just as the rest of our friends did, and thankfully the bus too. When I started college, they gave us a brief training saying to not roofie girls and help a girl who is roofied, but they can never begin to prepare you for how terrifying it is to help someone who's roofied. That was probably the worst experience of my life, and I wasn't even the one who was roofied. She couldn't walk or stand by herself and was falling asleep in my arms while we were walking through the streets. I'm honestly just glad she doesn't remember anything from that night because it wasn't pleasant. Story 52. This will probably get buried, but either way. When I was 13 years old, I was picked up by my bio mom after school one day and dragged to her friend's house because she wanted to continue her afternoon of drinking and crap talking. Driving with my alcoholic mother was always fun. Anyway, we got to the friend's house where I find my sister babysitting the children while the mothers continued to drink. About an hour later, after multiple futile attempts by my sister and I to get our mother to take us home, I asked her if I could play Brick Breaker on her BlackBerry. She obliged to get rid of me, so I went to her purse to grab the phone. As I turned the screen on, I saw a notification for 2 messages, and I immediately got that sick feeling in my stomach that whatever those messages were, they weren't good. Completely disregarding what my parents taught me about privacy, I opened the messages to satiate my own curiosity and was welcomed by 2 sexually explicit messages from a man who wasn't my father. At that point, after staring blankly at the messages for a minute and coming to grips with the fact that the life I knew was over, I put the phone back into the bag and went to play with the kids. My brain blacked the memory out until 2 months later, at the start of my freshman year, when my dad told me that he and my mother were separating. Now, almost 10 years later, I was able to tell that female dog that she isn't welcome in my life anymore. Ever since then, I've trusted that gut feeling and it's never steered me wrong. Edit 1. For clarification, I was subjected to years of emotional and physical abuse from my biomom, none of which my sister ever experienced. Story 53. Many years ago, for a few days, I needed to walk my mother's dogs in the evening. I drive to her place, get the dogs, go for a long walk, feed them, go home. One day, a Wednesday, they were extremely pulley on the walk, and it seemed like something went wrong inside me. Went home, I was living with my dad and sister at the time, and said, I think something's gone wrong. I may have pulled a muscle in my stomach or something. Next day, I felt worse and started vomiting. Again, I expressed how I thought something was very wrong, but my sister, who works in a hospital, just said it was a vomiting bug. I just started feeling worse and worse, vomiting more, and didn't sleep that night. Thursday. I awoke Friday. My dad was golfing and my sister was at work. I vomited once or twice and then thought about curling up and dying. But no, I thought I'll try to not die for a bit longer, so decided to pop out to the local GP center, which was about a 10-minute walk from my house. It took me just over an hour, and I thought about curling up and dying about 3 times along the way. Went into the surgery, took a number, and waited about 40 minutes to be seen. Doctor saw me, saw that I was ready to faint/vomit/die, and queried why I didn't make a big deal to be seen sooner. I said something along the lines of, dunno. She poked around me, gave me painkillers, and it seems like appendicitis. But it couldn't be that because I'd be in much more pain. But she did call an ambulance to bring me to A&E. In the ambulance, they poked me, gave me some painkillers, and said it couldn't be appendicitis because I'm not in enough pain. I get into A&E, they poke me, they say it can't be appendicitis. Some more people see me, poke me, say it can't be appendicitis. About 8 o'clock, a doctor sees me and does the same. But he does think that I should be x-rayed to see what is wrong with me. About 10 minutes after my x-ray, he comes rushing out and says I'm booked for surgery in 10 minutes, telling me my appendix was just about fit to explode. They took the evil bastard out. I was in recovery for a week, lost about 2 stone in weight, and wasn't really myself for a few months. The dogs did it, man. Those effing dogs did it. But I will never forget all the medical dudes telling me I would be in more pain. I responded to each one of them, I'm in severe pain here. It really hurts. Like 9 or 10 out of 10 pain. And each one came back, nah, you'd be screaming if it was your appendix. Story 54. My last employer, I had a manager whose territory I inherited and took over after he was promoted. I will defend the guy and say that I had no doubt that he was good at what he did before the promotion, but as a manager, he was absolute horse crap. To set the scene, I was promoted into my boss's position. Boss was promoted into a new leadership role. His manager had just been promoted into her director role, and her manager was promoted into a VP role. So, 4 different layers all had just been put into new leadership roles. If I had been given any other territory, I would have been fine, but the fact that I took over the territory of the guy that was now my manager was like drinking poison. I had always been a top performer and met or exceeded goals, and was on track to do the same in my new role. Every single day, however, was like walking on eggshells. I was accused of doing something I didn't do, which I could prove otherwise, and accused of not stuff that I could prove I did complete/do. Every time I had the email, voicemail, and documentation to back it up, my old manager had an attitude and look on his face like, I'll get you next time. Tie in the fact that he always had a sour face when it was just me and him, which would flip to a fake smile and excitement when his manager joined the picture, should have been a sign that I should have left sooner. My numbers could always back up my performance and that I was doing exactly what was expected, plus more. None of that mattered, however, and I was let go, which honestly was the best feeling ever. I was free of the toxic environment that poor leadership fostered. Ever hear the phrase that the beatings will stop when morale improves? That's how it felt towards the end. Story 55. Tonight, literally just now, I just sat down to relax after averting the crisis. That crisis being the untimely, albeit peaceful and painless, death of my whole family. We need some backstory first. Last weekend, there were heavy rains in my area. A previously small leak made itself known to be much more substantial and could no longer be ignored. Being of a low-income persuasion as we are, we can't afford to hire professionals for this kind of thing. It's only a last resort. But I'm pretty comfortable and confident tackling problems myself, so up the roof I go. After some examining, failed attempts and debating, we determined that the best course of action is to wrap our chimney in a tarp and call it a weekend. Keep in mind, it's pouring rain, and I've been on the roof for hours a day for 3 days. Now, this chimney isn't used for a fireplace, but rather it's the vent for our oil furnace. It's a very old house. If that vent were to be blocked, the exhaust from the furnace could back up into the house, replacing all the oxygen with carbon monoxide. Warm, cozy, non-life-sustaining carbon monoxide. We knew this going in, and specifically took precautions to avoid capping the vent, while still effectively waterproofing the chimney. We also discussed scenarios where the vent is blocked, how we would know, what we would do, etc. Satisfied that we're safe, we go about our lives, happy and dry. Fast forward a few days to last night. I can't sleep, so I'm up watching YouTube and browsing Reddit all night. Then I start feeling a little off. Nothing serious, nothing I would normally worry about, just a mild headache, maybe a bit woozy. I brush it off and continue watching. A few hours later, I'm ready for bed, but I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling. At this point, I'm not even considering carbon monoxide poisoning. I'm just tired and hungry, that's all. So I decide to go downstairs and have a snack before I sleep. This decision quite possibly saved the lives of everyone in the house. To think I almost didn't go. When I get downstairs, I notice an odd smell. As you might have guessed by now, furnace exhaust. It was familiar because I had gotten a face full of it while standing over the chimney. Immediately, I know what the problem is, and I rush to open windows and turn off the heater. I need to vent the house and get fresh oxygen in. Then, I realized that if I was feeling woozy upstairs, the problem is probably even worse downstairs, meaning my sleeping family might be in worse condition. I check everyone, and they're sleeping soundly. Phew. But the problem remains. The vent is blocked and the house is full of death gas. I can't leave the windows open all morning with the heater off because everyone will freeze. It's still dark outside, so I'm not keen on the idea of going onto the roof by myself to fix the problem. So I have to wake everyone up to ensure we're all safe, and so we can talk about what to do. In the end, we decide the best thing to do is wait until sunrise, then go up and fix the problem, which is exactly what we did. My mother and I go up there and pull the tarp back off the opening, ensuring it can't be blocked again. It's definitely less waterproof, but it's also death-proof. So here I am now, after staying up nearly 24 hours, climbing a ladder onto my roof in the morning sun, and saving my family's lives, all because I felt a little iffy before going to bed. Story 56. I predicted my grandmother's stroke. I was very close to my grandmother. She kind of raised me when I was little since my parents both worked. We lived approximately 2 miles away. A funny coincidence left me sitting with this horrible feeling. In 6th grade, I was kind of having a bad year, but still maintaining A's or B's, and then in the 3rd quarter, I got a C in English. That was the year my grandfather died. Fast forward to my 9th grade year. He was a new school, kind of having a bad year, but still maintaining A's or B's, and got a C in English the 3rd quarter. My mom picked me up from school, and I told her the same thing, that when I got AC last, my grandfather died, and she kind of laughed it off, but we haven't spoken to my grandmother in a while. She decided to check on her anyways, noticed that nobody answered the door since she didn't drive. She thought she might have been out with a neighbor because of what I told her, and she went next door to get the neighbor's key. She found her laying on the floor after just having a stroke. My mom told me that had I not said that, she would have never gone through and gotten the extra key to check on her. Unfortunately, she never recovered, but it was always stuck in my mind that I predicted her death. Still miss her. Story 57. My friend and I were in Louisville for the Sweet 16 games the year before last. On our way back to my truck afterwards, we were walking through a dark parking lot when a man, who looked to be homeless, began to approach us. I instantly got a weird vibe about it. When he got to us, he asked if we had a couple dollars we could give him, and he told us he was trying to get into a shelter for the night and that he had Crohn's and really needed to get to the shelter. He also seemed to be a drug user or something because he was shaking uncontrollably. It just felt like a really sketchy situation to us, considering we were in a dark area with no one else around. We didn't have any cash because of all the bar hopping we did before the game started, so we just said, "Sorry man, we don't have any on us," and immediately tried to get out of the situation. About 5 minutes later, we made it to my truck that was in the parking garage right next to that dark, empty lot. As we were approaching my truck to get in, we heard a couple girls screaming bloody murder, so we ran over to the guardrail to see what was going on. The lack of light in the lot hindered us a bit, but we see a group of about 5 or 6 people running away from what looked to be the guy who approached us. Turns out the guy crapped himself and threw it all over 2 of the girls in the group. Yeah, that's certainly disgusting, but man, could it have been a lot worse. I would much rather have fresh fecal matter thrown at me than have this drug user pull a gun or a knife or something like that and try to actually hurt someone. So yeah, nasty, but fortunate that that's all you got thrown at you. Story 58. It was April of my junior year of high school. It was a cool morning, partly cloudy with a chance of rain. I got out of my car and began walking into the building. I couldn't quite place it, but something was off. The air was different. It was just too quiet. At the time, I just wrote it off as my ADHD pulling one of 100 TV/movie quotes about it being quiet, too quiet. But the feeling persisted. I went into the choir room, where I always hung out before school, and greeted one of my friends and my lifelong teacher friend. She must have sensed my uneasiness because she asked me what was wrong. I told her, I don't know, something just doesn't feel right. Sure enough, literally 2 seconds after I finished that last sentence, the tornado sirens in the building went off and we all had to file into the costume storage area under the stage. Turns out, a storm cell had moved in at record speed and created a perfect tornado. When we were allowed to go outside about 2 hours later, there was still a lightning threat. 2 of the largest trees on campus had branches torn off. Multiple cars had damage from said branches, and a bus had tipped over. Nothing terribly dangerous as everybody was brought inside in time. But it is still one of the weirdest sequence of events I've experienced. Looking back, I probably noticed some sort of pressure difference outside that created a hole for the storm to move into. No, instincts can be crazy, man. Story 59. My wife and I were about to have our first child, so we went around touring daycare centers. The first one we went to was within a few blocks of our house, so naturally that was the top of our list for convenience. We get there and start going through, and the whole time I just remember feeling like I don't want my kid here all day, but I couldn't really explain why it felt so off. We got done and my wife didn't love it, but thought it seemed good enough. I contested. In the end, we ended up paying my wife's mother to watch our kid, and it worked out fantastic for everyone. I truly couldn't be happier, and my girls loved their time with their grandma. Several months after we toured that daycare center, it closed down abruptly, only to be revealed to the community that the owner's husband was SAing some of the kids there. I'm not a terribly irrational person, but I can guarantee that had my kid been going there and I found this out, I would have found that man, and it would have ended very poorly. Story 60. Fob Fenty, Jalabad, Afghanistan. It was a Wednesday, spaghetti night, the only time we had tolerable chow. I was in the chow line, next up, and was busy debating whether to get meat sauce or marinara, when suddenly, just as I hold out my tray, the incoming IDF, indirect fire, alarm starts blaring. Behind the counter, the Afghan server's eyes go so round that the tops disappear into his bushy unibrow. I'm cussing to myself, as is every American sitting at the DFAC cafeteria. All any of us wanted was our effing spaghetti. The Afghan hurls himself over the counter and weaves between the packed tables, fleeing for the nearest shelter bunker. I stand there, and for one hideous moment, I ponder reaching over the counter and ladling the noodles onto the tray myself. But I listen to that voice in my head, which is saying, better move, because in about 10 seconds, you're going to look a lot like that meat sauce. I drop my tray and sprint across the street to my hardened building. The second I shut the door, there's this loud bang on the street outside. I even hear the shrapnel ping off the steel. Shaking, I sit down next to my XO and ask him to pass a breadstick. Turns out, the Taliban had gotten lucky and scored a rocket hit almost on top of our DFAC, which they always aimed for. Had I waited another few seconds, I'd be maimed or dead. One slow Afghan lost his legs. Poor dude. Story 61. I'm a first responder. It's basically my job to show up and live with my own version of the something is very wrong here mindset. I can walk into most rooms now and get an immediate sense of safe versus not safe. Basically, like I've developed a new sense. Sometimes I can tell that I'm going to get called before it happens. Sometimes not. But there has only been one night where I got a sense that something was very, very wrong. Being proved correct that something was horribly wrong ended up being something I'll never forget. It had been an easy, uneventful day, but when I went to try to nap for the night, I had this sense that something bad was about to happen. The more I tried to sleep, and with every minute that passed, it got worse. Then we got the call. Vehicle accident. Multiple injured, vehicle on fire. That night, I showed up to a wreck and knew everyone. Every patient, every responder. They were friends of my sister's and friends of mine. 3 died instantly, 2 survived, all around the age of 21. My friends and family know I was there, but I'll never tell them that I pronounced their friends dead, that I was the one to say, time of death, 3:13 a.m., and confirm they will never go home again. They can never know. It was hard enough to wake them the next morning and say, your friends are dead. I found out the next morning that my best friend's sister, who was basically family, was supposed to be in that car. She described to me many months later that she got the same feeling and decided not to get in the car. If you ever get this feeling, don't ignore it. It could save your life. Story 62. I used to hang out with some terrible people in my teenage years. I was 19, had a house, and basically got taken advantage of by people who wanted to party. They would get me hammered and I'd pass out and they kept partying. Soon I put a stop to it. Couldn't deal with it anymore. One day, 2 of the friends came over and we chill. Then one of them pulls out a gun. I know these guys are broke and for sure couldn't afford a gun. Something didn't feel right. I told them that if they want to come chill at my house ever again, they can't bring that gun. They stopped hanging around with me. That same week, they went to a party with it. One of those guys wrecked on Xanax and alcohol, played Russian roulette, and blew his brains out in front of everyone at the party, including my sister. I was invited to the party. I'm glad I didn't go. Turns out they stole my Xbox 360 and traded it for a stolen gun that had been at FBI officers. It was a snub nose and he shot himself with a hollow point. Don't play with guns and do drugs. Or be like me and stay the hell away from guns. Story 63. I posted this before in response to another Ask Reddit question, but it fits so perfectly here too. TLDR at the bottom. Went camping with my girlfriend back in the late 1990s. I think I just graduated college. Maybe it was my senior year. Anyway, we got a little pup tent and super basic camping gear from Kmart. We get on the road and just drive aimlessly. Our whole intent was to just spend 4 days camping in different places and visiting whatever attractions we came across. We didn't really have any destination in mind. The first night, we stopped for dinner at some truck stop in Missouri and asked the waitress if there are any campgrounds around. She tells us that there's one that's out of business, but people still crash there. We drive there and everything is locked up. You can still get in, but the bathrooms and lodge are all locked. It also looks pretty dumpy with a lot of garbage. The place is deserted aside from another couple who set up camp pretty close to the entrance. Being a dog lover, my girlfriend notices that they've got a beagle and she gets all gushy about how cute he is and blah blah blah. I drive around the campground, which is laid out kind of like the Olympic rings, or 2 figure 8s stacked on top of one another. We get to the very back of the campground and it's filthy. We actually get a little nervous because it seems like this place is just a haven for drunks, drug addicts, and a-holes who come here to party. But no one is here, just their remnants. As I'm driving, I see a little side road that's a bit overgrown. I figure it might be less used and we'd be less visible. So I head down and it's actually a nice little clearing with 4 or 5 sites. They're pretty clean and we set up camp. We play Mancala until it gets dark and then we just hang out talking. Around 10 p.m., we noticed the very faint campfire of the couple we passed earlier. Nothing special, just noticed it and didn't realize we were that close. We head into the tent and proceed to get frisky. She was kind of vocal, but not screaming or anything, and I hear a dog barking. It's not just a random bark. This thing is barking like crazy. It sees something or is barking out of concern/fear. Girlfriend keeps writing. Then we hear a loud, blood-curdling yelp from the dog. Then woman screams. Then we hear a male voice yelling. We can't make out the words, but it sounds like an argument. Girlfriend abruptly stops. I've got a handful of tit and thumb on a clit, and we're both silent and motionless. It was pitch black, but I can only imagine we had both confused and concerned looks on our faces. The argument continues, and we're trying to make out what's being said. Then I hear a twig snap somewhat nearby. Not close, but not far either. All of a sudden, I get this intense feeling of dread. I guide her off and whisper, "Get in the car now." I grab my clothes and realize she's getting dressed. My heart is racing. I'm terrified. I really feel like someone is coming for me and wants to kill me. I say quietly but forcefully, "Don't get dressed, just get in the car." She says in her normal volume, "I'm not going out naked." That's when we hear a guy say, "Did you hear that?" It was quiet, but it was clear. They couldn't have been more than 100 feet away. Our car was maybe 10 to 15 feet from the tent. I pull the keys out of my pocket and whisper, "We gotta go, now!" I unzip the tent and we run to the car. As I hit the unlock button, the headlights and taillights come on. There are two guys standing about 50 to 60 feet away. They freeze for a second, then start running at us. We jump in the car, and as I'm jamming the key in the ignition, they get to the front of the car. I get the car started and look up to see these two standing there. They're about mid-30s and look like classic bedraggled hillbillies. One has a big stick in his hand, and he's holding it up. I had backed up to a tree, so I could only go forward. Keep in mind that my girlfriend and I are buck naked. The dome light hasn't even gone off yet, and I hear one guy say, "What y'all got in there?" I scream, "Move!" The other guy comes to my girlfriend's window, leans down, and says, "She got some nice titties." And she did. They were spectacular. She grabs her clothes and bunches them up to cover up a little. I roll down my window about 2 inches and yell, "I will run you the F over. Move." The guy with the stick says, "I'll take some of them titties first." The two start laughing, and the guy at the window leans down, and the first thing I think is that he's grabbing a rock to break the window, or he's going to knife the tire. I throw it in drive and tap the gas, hoping to scare him away. Hillbilly with the stick doesn't even flinch. He slams the butt of the stick on the hood, looks positively evil as he looks me square in the eye and yells, "Give me all the money you got and you can go." My girlfriend's window shatters. She screams. I hit the gas. Hillbilly rolls up and off the side of the hood, and I'm off. We get to the front of the campground where there's a classic hillbilly pickup truck blocking the entrance. The couple who were there are now gone. Their car was gone, but their tent is on fire. I quickly scan the entrance area and see a broken chunk of fence, wood ranch fence with the 3 horizontal wood pieces. I head right for it and get out onto the road. We just haul ass. Maybe a mile down, we see the beagle run limping along the road. My girlfriend screams to stop for the dog. I slam on the brakes after making sure no one was following. She gets out and finishes getting dressed. I'm still buck naked, so I jump out and start throwing on clothes. She gets the dog, and his paw is all bloody. I see headlights coming from way behind and scream, "Get in the effing car!" And we're off again. We get to a little one-horse town and nothing is open. Even the effing police station is closed. We park behind the police station and my girlfriend checks out the dog. He's okay, but it looks like someone stepped on his foot and he was bleeding from around his nails. She wrapped his paw. We kind of rested for an hour or two until a cop finally showed up. We told him what happened, and he actually yelled at us for trespassing. Okay, yes, we did, but seriously? He says he'll check it out and that we should head on back home. I tell him I want to file a police report for my insurance, and he says, "Don't have time for that. I have to go see a campground." He just leaves. My girlfriend and I wait until morning and file a police report with another officer. The first guy never came back and never reported anything, and we left. Instead of finishing our nice little weekend adventure, we drove straight to my girlfriend's mom's house. The dog had a tag, but it didn't have owner information. It just had the dog's name, Rookie. My girlfriend's mom had 5 dogs and lived on a farm. She was happy to take in Rookie, and he seemed happy to have a bunch of playmates. We looked online to find the owners, but the internet back in the 90s wasn't anything like it is today. We never found the owners. We never found anything about that campground. Rook must have been fairly young because he lived until 2011. This happened in 1998. My girlfriend and I are no longer together, but her mom liked me and sent me an email when Rookie died. Anyway, that's it. Oh, I almost forgot. Damage to the car was $4,800. Bodywork and paint on the hood, new front bumper, got cracked somehow, new window, new headlight assembly, broke it on the fence, and had to get the right side repainted because I scraped the fence front to back as I was leaving. Thank God for insurance. And since I'm sure someone will ask, the campground was north or northeast of Jordan, Missouri. Story 64. There have been a couple times where I've had the, "Man, that was supposed to be when some disaster struck, but my something's off meter has been with wild animals." 2 separate occasions I've been hiking. One was in the Appalachian Mountains, was up front with a few friends where I just froze. No warning signs or sounds. I just stopped. got a crippling drop in my stomach, and told everyone stop in as high a volume of a whisper as I could. Everything goes silent. A friend tries to say, "What?" And I put my hand over his mouth, and about 30 yards ahead was a black bear and a cub crossing the trail. Black bears are no grizzlies, but you still don't want to startle them, so we just waited to pass. The second occasion wasn't in Blue Ridge, but with the same crew. They brought up that story and we all laughed. The next day, we're getting ready to make camp, and I had this terrifying feeling there was someone in the woods watching us. Human. I freaked out a bit. Friends told me to brush it off. We were too far out. The likeliness of seeing other hikers was slim. It's been about 20 minutes and I still can't shake that feeling. So I just straight up told them, "Hey, I'm not camping here tonight. Y'all can stay or come with, but I'm moving up to the shelter." That was a little ways off. I pack up my crap. One of my friends says he will come with and leave. The other two will stay. I literally set 1 foot out of sight of the camp, and I heard that terrifying howl/scream that was posted on Reddit a few weeks ago of a mountain lion/cougar. I never had the hair on my neck stand up so straight. The worst part was having to walk back toward the sound and wait in the camp for them to hastily pack up their crap because we all needed to move together. I never saw it, but it was so loud it had to have been less than 50 yards out. I didn't sleep a single second or walk farther than the fire to take a piss that night. Story 65. Finally, a thread I can contribute in. Back in 1996, I was 13 and into skating in a big way. I got invited to go with my friend Paul to his older cousin's house 98 miles away in Blackpool and spend a few days skating. This dude's wife was away with their kids, so it would just be 3 of us, and he promised to let us have the run of his place. Well, we arrived at his cousin's place, and it was a second-story bedsit. Really grimy, dark, and had a strange musty smell. I later learned that's what weed smells like. His cousin immediately took the spending money my mom had given me as payment for bed and board, and left me facing 3 days in a strange place with no money. The guy gave me instant creeps. Well, later that day, one of his other cousins came over, a younger girl, maybe a little older than me, and they all started smoking weed and drinking. I thought it might end up being a cool party, but already the older cousin and the younger female cousin were getting closer than seemed comfortable, so I left to go out for a skate. Here's the very wrong bit. When I got back to the bedsit, the two of them had gone from being quite close to being together. I knew from Paul they were first cousins, but I didn't know how old she was. Either way, I knew it was wrong, so I packed up my hold all and made to leave. The guy saw this, jumped out of the double bed and threatened me, asking where I was going, who I was going to tell, etc. I'm freaking out, saying I want to go home, this isn't right. He's calling me a pussy, etc. My friend tried to calm everyone down, and I took the window of opportunity to dart out of there. This guy chases me. I'm running down the street, big bag, skates around my neck, being chased by this half-naked stoner. Right before he catches me, I run into a kebab shop and he turns around and leaves. I found a payphone, reverse charged some calls, and got my dad to book a coach for me after spending a total of 10 hours in Blackpool. I told my dad everything, and he immediately went and confronted my friend's parents. I don't know what came next, but I understand it wasn't pretty. I moved away shortly after and didn't speak to my friend for almost 2 years, but when we caught up, he mentioned that his younger cousin did confess to sleeping with the older cousin while she was underage. He ended up in jail, and the family disowned him. Turns out, this guy had been in jail before for assault and was known as a scumbag by the locals. The sad part is, he'd been babysitting his female cousin most weekends for a few years prior to us going over. Story 66. I'm a union officer that works for a federal entity and from time to time have to attend union conferences. A national conference was scheduled to be in Las Vegas from the last week of September until the first week of October. Being a single parent who has my daughter full-time aside from working, I had no desire to attend because I didn't want to be away from her, but had to due to my duties. My girlfriend is in school about 2 hours away from us and came to visit that weekend before I left. She asked me if I was excited, and leading up to knowing I was going to have to leave, I just had this serious foreboding. I expressed having no desire to go because, as I stated above, but I'll just deal with it this time. I then stated specifically, and 2, I don't know. I just feel like something bad is going to happen. I don't know what it's going to be, whether it's towards me or close, but I just have that strange feeling. Plane arrives in Vegas at 4 p.m. on October 1st. Hotel I'm booked at is right down the road. That night, I was at John Rich's bar watching him and his band play, not knowing there was a festival going on and that he had just came from playing there. Very next morning, at about 5 a.m., I had security banging at my door to see if I was safe. I was so confused and realized I had my phone on silent and became extremely confused on why I had over 100 plus calls, texts, voicemails, etc. I called my girlfriend, and it answered to the sound of a fearful relief as she spoke and told me her and her mom, my parents, and sibling had been trying to contact me for hours, and over 50 people were killed and hundreds injured by a mass shooting. I was speechless. This was that feeling I was having weeks prior to having to be there. They called my room phone and my cell phone, and I had slept through all the aftermath and panic. I never felt so oblivious and exposed in my entire life, and truly creeped out by such an ill feeling unraveling to happen in a sense. Story 67. I used to work as a nurse assistant, and one day a new male nurse was hired. I didn't trust him from the beginning. There was just something eerie about him. Let's call him a-hole. We also had one of our residents, an old lady who had beginning dementia and had a history of being abused basically all her life. First, her father, and later her husband. Let's call her Mary. Sometimes Mary got these panic episodes where she claimed that, quote, they were going to hurt her, never really specifying who they were. Upon seeing a familiar face, she always calmed down. That face was usually mine. Ricky is what she called me. Really important, that is not my real name, but I gave up correcting her after a few times. Now, a few weeks with a-hole on the floor, and Mary starts accusing him of also hurting her, which was quickly dismissed as another one of Mary's episodes. The head nurse even felt so sorry for a-hole, but when I was alone with Mary, she kept accusing him, which is really weird since she never named anyone ever before. So, the next staff meeting, I couldn't hold it any longer, and I throw the question out. Why does Mary keep accusing you of abuse? So a-hole stutters that Mary also accuses me of abuse when he's alone with her, and that I should know that because her trauma, blah blah blah. He even tried to play it like it wasn't even an assistant's concern, blaming me of stepping over the line. Then I asked him, so does Mary really accuse me, my real name, of abuse? A-hole answered, yes, Mary says things like, my real name beats me. And that's when I had proof a-hole was lying, because Mary had no clue what my real name was. As I said, to Mary, my name was Ricky. Story 68. I have one. Saved my grandma's life. When I was about 10 years old, my grandma stayed in our basement, and we'd occasionally bring her with us when we went to the park or out for activities because she didn't get out much. I went downstairs to see if she wanted to go, but she wasn't home. Looked around a little and couldn't find her. She may have taken the bus or went with her daughters, who occasionally pick her up for pottery, but something felt off. I called for her several more times before returning upstairs to let my dad know she wasn't there, but I wanted him to check because I couldn't see her and it felt off. He said it wasn't a big deal and she may have just went on a walk. I pressed him, even though we were in a hurry, and he decided to go check. Turns out, my grandma was on the other side of the couch, face down from diabetic shock, which was the reason I couldn't see her when looking across the living room when I first came downstairs. I remember my dad telling me to call 911. She could have died if we didn't go back down to look for her. I'll never remember that feeling that something was wrong. Almost could feel it in the air. Story 69. Around 5 years ago, I was signed on to be a graduate assistant in our university's Student Relations Center. It was my first week, and I was given the menial task of putting in the data we acquired from freshman surveys. It was standard stuff, questions such as how they would rate the university's resources or their experience so far, nothing to look deeply into. For some reason, I decided to read into these surveys instead of only inputting data. Maybe I was just bored, who knows? All I know is that this one survey just didn't seem right. This freshman wrote a lot in the past or present tense, nothing about her upcoming future at all. All other surveys had substance to them, but hers just felt empty. It was also my first semester working towards my master's in clinical counseling, so I was scared I was being paranoid due to the stuff we were covering in class. However, I weighed my options and figured I'd rather be seen as paranoid than not speak to this girl before something bad happened. Went to my supervisor for approval, then emailed the girl asking for a meeting. Turns out she shows up, and as soon as I ask her what's really going on, she breaks down. She'd been planning on unaliving herself. I stayed by her side for several hours and walked her to the dean's office while we waited on her parents. When I got home, I just cried tears of relief, thinking of what could have happened. A year later, she found me and gave me a huge hug, thanking me for everything that happened. Now, as a therapist, I know to trust my instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it's better to be perceived as paranoid than the opposite. Story 70. Not me, but my grandma. She grew up in East Texas, where people have different ideas about what constitutes drinking and driving. It was prom night at her high school, and she, her date, and all her friends were drinking heavily. Her friends decided to drive to the next party, and after a few winding turns, she got a really bad feeling about how the driver was acting. She immediately told them to pull over, to which they told her that was crazy because she was about 7 to 8 miles away from her house. She insisted and walked home barefoot. When she got home, her entire family was hysterical. When they saw her, they immediately screamed with joy, and when she asked them what had happened, they told her they thought she was still in the car with her friends, which had been hit by a train after the driver tried to speed and beat it at the railroad crossing. Everyone in the car died instantly. This was a while ago, and cars were death traps. Crazy. If she didn't hop out of that car, half of my family wouldn't be alive today. She was one smart cookie. Story 71. 5 or 6 years ago, I was on a work trip to Vietnam. I was traveling with an engineer that had very little experience in field work, and she had been in contact with our host from Singapore. She was told that there would be a car waiting to take us from the airport to the hotel, since we were getting in at 2 a.m. local time. Our host would not be there to meet us. We had spent a total of 36 hours traveling, from initial takeoff to final landing, and neither of us had really been able to get any sleep. As we were heading out of the airport, very sleep deprived, we're approached by 2 men that say they have a car waiting to take us to the hotel. We did not question this and went with them. We passed through security checkpoints to gain entry into the city proper, and the entire time the passenger is talking to us about the Vietnam War and how there are no hard feelings. I start to notice that we've passed the same structures a couple times. It's quite dark and I was very tired, so it took a bit to click. The car stops at a random ATM and we're told they need cash for the ride and that they do not have a card reader in the car. I explain I was the only one that had a card, hoping my nearly unconscious companion would take the hint. I had already maxed out the allowable travel amount on my card through a cash advance, so I was not concerned. I get out of the car and insist both driver and passenger go with me. While at the ATM, the driver takes my card and starts hitting buttons on the screen, while the passenger standing off to my right constantly taps my arm and asks to me, trying to pull my attention away from the screen. Joke's on them, they can't get any cash out. They insist on going to another ATM. I explain that if they take us to the hotel, that I can get cash from the desk clerk, but they ignore me. At this point, my engineer companion speaks up and says she has a card they can try. Now I'm getting nervous. They go to one more ATM and get $500 from her card, we found out. I see in the distance a large neon sign for our hotel and start insisting they drop us off. They politely refuse and say we're almost there, as they turn down a side street going away from the hotel sign. Having had enough and now my adrenaline is going, I start to reach for the passenger as I get my pocket knife out and the car dies. I immediately jump out of the car and drag my engineer with me. The 2 fellas jump out also and start telling me to get back in. I'm past the point of caring what happens and growl/overly aggressively tell them to open the trunk and give me our luggage with my knife still unopened in my hand. They do, and just then an official taxi drives by, which I flag down, and we get into leaving the car and the 2 fellas on the road. We were 3 blocks from our hotel and headed away from it when their car broke down. Story 72. Throwaway, obviously. I used to despise my mom's, now ex-boyfriend. She never understood why and blamed it on the fact that he just wasn't my dad, failing to take into consideration that I was great with all her other boyfriends up until that point. He convinced her to move us to another country so he could enlist her into his drug business. Never separated with his wife, who threatened self-unaliving when she found out about the affair, and was so sloppy that the feds got tipped off, forcing my mom to go into hiding and sending me off to live with my dad. I haven't seen her in 10 plus years because of how far she's had to flee. I effing hated that grimy little mother effer with everything inside my little 12-year-old body from the second I met him. I was right all along. Note, I won't recognize my mom's part in this. She's always been involved in some sort of drug business when I was growing up, but the difference was that her previous boyfriends presented themselves as clean-cut and were genuinely nice guys who tried to make a connection with me. Not to mention they were smart. This guy looked like a effing homeless farmer and never parented his 6 children and was ghetto AF. Story 73. Not my story, but I'm a police officer in the UK, and this happened to a couple of my colleagues. We're all volunteers and work one night a week, so it's amazingly lucky they were in the right place at the right time, and also that they followed their guts. They were on duty in a car one night, driving past a hotel in a busy part of town, when they saw a couple going through the door. Something seemed weird about them. They're not entirely sure what, but the woman was much drunker than the man, and they just didn't quite look natural as a couple. They spin the car around and go into the hotel, separating the couple and asking the male what their relationship was. As they press him for further detail, he keeps on changing his story. They're a couple returning to their room, then actually they're just friends. Then it's their first date. Something is clearly amiss. Meanwhile, the woman who started out pretty tipsy seems to be getting drunker by the second. She's gone from staggering a bit to unable to stand unaided. They decide she has in fact likely been drugged and quickly bundle her into an ambulance, and one of them jumps in the back. Something interesting happens as they arrive at hospital, but unfortunately it makes this story too identifiable. But as a result, they discover that the woman is extremely vulnerable. I'm afraid I don't know what the results of any tests were or what happened to the guy. However, regardless of what was actually proved, it's obvious that they stopped a vulnerable person from being essayed that night just because they felt something might be wrong and acted immediately on the slightest of suspicions. Story 74. When my older sister was about 16 or 17, she was dating a guy who was a few years older than her. Everyone thought he was a decent guy, if a bit quiet. The first time I met him, I just didn't feel right about him. I had never before, and have never since, disliked anyone upon introduction. He wasn't particularly rude, nor did he give me any reason not to like him at that moment, but I just did not like him. He gave me bad vibes. Everyone wanted me to give him a chance, so, against my better judgment, I decided to shut my mouth about how icky he made me feel and let sleeping dogs lie. He continued dating my sister, and eventually married her and moved in with us for a couple of years, over which I gradually hated him more and more, just having to be in close proximity to him for prolonged periods of time. After my sister got pregnant and had a son to protect, it came out that he was physically and emotionally abusing her the entire time. I never let anyone who shot down my initial proposal that he was not a good dude live it down. Story 75. I've been dealing with a chronic illness for a few years. There is light at the end of the tunnel, as I'm supposed to have surgery early next year to address the issue once and for all. However, 2 Mondays ago, I began having a new type of pain I haven't felt in the years I've had this condition, and after a couple of days of it not going away, I took myself to the ER. I had blood drawn and checked. Doctor said nothing was wrong and sent me on my way. The next morning, the pain was even worse. I was sure something was amiss, so I went back to the ER for a second opinion. After blood work, an ultrasound, and a physical, I was given a prescription for antibiotics and was told I had chlamydia and had to take the full course of meds and sent me home. I knew that was BS. So I decided to drive further to another hospital because I was convinced there was something wrong. And as I was about to leave the house, my wife came home and offered to drive me. Thanks, baby. We didn't make it to the end of our street before I passed out in the passenger seat and began having seizures, so she got me to the closest ER, a little satellite ER in the burbs. Think urgent care with more equipment. Evidently, my chronic condition had ruptured the blood supply to my spleen, and I had been hemorrhaging blood into my abdomen for days. My blood pressure had dropped to barely registering. I was taken by ambulance back to the hospital that sent me home twice in the past 24 hours, and I underwent an emergency operation to seal off the artery and a few other spots that were weak/hemorrhaging, as well as saving my life. So if the doctor tells you have chlamydia, don't believe them. You're actually dying of blood loss. Story 76. My dad tells this story every time we go to a certain spot on the Umkomaas River, South Africa. It gives me chills again just remembering it. When my dad was 13, he was with all his brothers and a few male cousins, 8 of them in total, ranging in ages between 12 and 15, camping by the side of the river on the family farm. It was the school holidays, and being farm boys in the 1960s, it was common for them to be without adults for extended periods and left to fish, swim, hunt, and mess around to their heart's content. They had set up 2 tents a stone's throw from the riverbank, and right up against a very steep, rocky embankment. When my dad tells this story, his eyes light up as he explains how they were having the time of their lives with every moment filled with adventure. His own father, my grandpa, would check on them twice a day, just after sunrise and just before sunset, and bring them supplies lovingly made by the women of the homestead. They had been there 3 days and 2 nights, and on the third day, my grandpa came down and told them they needed to pack up right away. They had planned to stay one more night and leave early the next morning, as there was a local gymkhana, games and competitions on horses, happening. The boys protested like crazy, desperate to continue the fun, but my grandpa put his foot down and told the boys they needed to get back home earlier than planned to help get the horses and tackle ready for the next day because he wasn't going to do it all by himself. Later on, he would admit that the boys would have had time in the morning to get everything ready, but he had felt uneasy and uncomfortable, and likely a little jealous, and so had summoned the boys home. The next morning, as they all headed out to the neighbor's farm for the gymkhana, they had to drive past the camping spot to pick up one of the boys' shoes, which he had forgotten behind. And there, exactly where the 2 tents had been, lay a massive boulder that had dislodged from the steep bank and rolled down to the flat. It would have crushed and killed the majority of the men in my family, including my dad. There are over 30 of my generation of cousins and siblings that would not be around today. My grandpa hadn't acted on his uneasy feeling. Story 77. A few years ago, my ex-husband and I were trying for baby number 2. Unlike our first one, we got pregnant on the first try. I literally felt it the moment I got pregnant. In the exact same moment, I knew I would not be having that baby. I even said it to my ex. I just got pregnant, but we're going to lose it. He laughed and told me I was being silly. About 10 days later, I wordlessly showed him the positive pregnancy test. He was so excited, but I couldn't celebrate. I felt numb. I wanted another baby, but I just knew. Went to midwife for my first scan at 6 weeks. She was also my midwife for baby number 1. She was really excited for me. Even before she had turned on the ultrasound, though, I calmly said, "I'm going to lose this baby. It just isn't mine." She tried to soothe me, told me lots of moms felt anxious about that, especially after a perfect first birth. She said lots of second-time moms worry that their luck has run out, but that everything would be okay. I just lay there in silence. She hooked up the machine. She found the sac. She started looking for the fetal pulse and heartbeat. She kept looking and looking and looking. She asked if I was maybe wrong and how far along I was. I just looked at her. She turned off the machine. 2 weeks later, I miscarried. I bled all summer. We'd missed our window to conceive. Missing that window led to several breakdowns in my marriage, which led eventually to heartbreak and bankruptcy and attempted self-unaliving and divorce and ruined lives. If I'd been able to keep that baby, I'd still be married to my best friend, still sleeping in the same home as my child every night. I know that as surely as I knew I'd not be able to hold on to it. I still think about that moment. The moment when I knew I was pregnant with my non-baby. Like looking through a window in time, feeling everything that is going to come, knowing it's going to be bad, and knowing you can't stop any of it. I don't know why I knew, or how. All I know is that knowing didn't stop any of it from happening. Story 78. Well, kinda late to the party and probably gonna get buried to F, but why the hell not? I never really told anyone this story, by the way. It's hard to think about, but maybe telling it will be therapeutic? I had a weird feeling about the husband of one of my wife's coworkers, before we were married, still dating at the time and living together. We had all gone out in a group to the bar to drink and to go to an after-hours club. I wasn't feeling well, so I quit drinking and stayed off to the side watching them. Possibly low blood sugar, not drunk. The dude was creepy as F and very touchy. I got instant bad vibes, but tried to brush them off as his wife was with us. I told her about it and about the way he was staring at her, dancing inappropriately, and she said that I was just being a buzzkill and overreacting. It was her first big girl job out of college, and she wanted to fit in and be cool. Fast forward to a couple weeks later, when my GF was again invited to go out with them as a group. I wasn't invited, and felt weirded out, as she/we didn't know these people outside of work. I told my GF not to go, and she just said I was being weird. I sat by my phone and decided to call her at around 10 p.m. to see how her night was going, and when she'd be home. I always like to stay up and wait when roommates/friends/loved ones were out. I called her phone a few times and finally a guy answered. He was one of the bartenders and said that the purse and phone were left behind at the bar. I got a sickening feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know where her friends lived or how to get in contact with them. I paced around the apartment for a few hours, wondering if I should call the police. At about 2:30 a.m. I went to bed, still uneasy, but hoping she just got drunk early and crashed at one of her friends' houses. I was woken up at 5:30 in the morning to loud pounding on the front door. It was my GF, delirious and stumbling. She pushed past me to the bedroom, fell on the bed, and passed out. She had pissed her pants. When she awoke, she cried and told me that she thought she got drugged by that creepy husband of her coworker and dragged to a hotel and then SA'd. She said she woke up in a hotel room with him and wouldn't tell me specifics. It was unlike her to get so drunk so fast and leave all her crap behind at the bar. I didn't need to ask too much because I knew what had happened. When she had sobered up enough, I helped her get her stuff from the bar from the night before. She told me bits and pieces of the story. Apparently, the guy disappeared at the bar from his wife and got my GF apart from the rest of the group. He likely slipped her something in a drink, maybe Xanax, and told his wife he was going home. My guess is that he also told her that my GF got a cab for herself. To cover his tracks and the gap of time he was unaccounted for, he made up a stupid story. He stopped at a gas station or 7-Eleven and bought some canned soup that he dumped all over his shirt. He told his wife that he had car trouble, threw up on himself, and took a nap in his car to sober up. He then claimed he woke up, fixed the car, and drove himself home. Instead, he dragged my unconscious GF to a hotel, did his thing, and drove her back to our place. What made this all worse is that he teased me about it, literally bragging about holding this over me and my GF. Eventually, I found out where her coworker lived. For almost a year, I literally had to stop myself from going over there and killing him with my bare hands. As a former athlete and in my early 20s, I was 6'5" and 250 pounds, and a still raging ball of testosterone. That was 10 years ago. The way I try to rationalize it today is that had I acted on my feelings, I would have been locked up in jail for life, considering the ugly things I would have done to him. Cruel, unusual, effed up, Pulp Fiction type crap, in the middle of the street. I also would not have ever gotten married or had the beautiful children that I do today. I still haven't completely gotten over it, and probably never will, but that awful piece of crap life I didn't take allowed me to create 2 beautiful ones of my own. Story 79. I'm a nurse and used to work on a surgical floor, and we would occasionally get pre-op cardiac surgery patients. Oftentimes, patients will be on a heparin drip, a medication that thins your blood, which makes it easier to move out clogged vessels. One of these patients, who was on a heparin drip, began complaining of a headache, and the nurse gave her some Tylenol with little effect. The woman continued complaining and was very visibly uncomfortable. Her nurse called the PA, who was rather dismissive, and wrote for some Fioricet, a bit stronger than Tylenol and can be good for migraines. I just had a really bad feeling about this patient. Her vital signs at this point were fine and she was perfectly coherent. History of migraines, so nothing crazy out of the ordinary. But I just felt like something was off. I asked her nurse if the PA might want to do a CT, since the woman was on a heparin drip, and my comment was kind of laughed off. I didn't push the matter as the other nurses had years of experience and I had only a few years. The woman's headache continues to get worse, and at the point where she begins vomiting and cannot sit still, the PA decides something is probably wrong and sends her for a CT. The woman had a massive brain bleed and was immediately incubated and sent to the ICU. She was dead by the morning. The PA was congratulated for deciding to send her off for a CT and was talking to everyone saying, quote, "I just had a feeling something was off." The nurse of the patient felt horrible and said to me, "You called it." She's one of the best nurses I know and was beside herself about the whole thing. To this day, I still remember this incident any time I question my gut when I feel like something is wrong. I work in an NICU now, and many times the babies will send you small signs that they're starting to get sick, and I always push the issue as far as I can when I'm concerned. There have been times where a baby was worked up and they turned out to be perfectly fine, but I would so much rather have it this way. Story 80. Now I can finally tell the story of how my mom and coach almost killed me. A little bit of backstory. 2 weeks prior to this event, I had sliced open my finger pretty bad trying to catch a falling knife. Different story. So the events of this story are the first time I've swam in 2 weeks. I was about 16 or 17, senior in high school at this time, about midway through the swim season. We're at this rather large meet for our area, so everyone, including me, is trying their hardest. In hindsight, this wasn't the best idea for me. After my first event, I start to get this pain in my left shoulder, but it's not quite my shoulder. It's sort of under/inside my shoulder, if that makes sense. It feels a little abnormal, but I think, hey, I've been out for a couple weeks, my body is probably just protesting to the sudden workout, and brush it off. After my second event, the pain spreads across my back to my spine, and I start to think something is very wrong. I told my coaches and my mom, and they all say something along the lines of, "You've been out for a while, you're just pulling muscles." But I've been an athlete for 5 years at this point. I know what a pulled muscle feels like, and this is not that. And I try to tell them that, but they brush it off. Come lunchtime, the pain is almost unbearable, and I can barely walk. It's spread all across my back and to my chest as well. So much so that on the bus ride to the restaurant, I can do little more than lay in my seat and try not to scream every time the bus hits a bump. When we get back from lunch, everyone is convinced that it's still pulled muscles, and my mom thinks I need to pop my back, so she makes me lay on the ground and has my teammate walk on my back despite my protests, which obviously doesn't do a damn thing. At this point, I know it's more than just pulled muscles, and my teammates are starting to realize it too. But the adults just can't get it through their thick skulls that they could be wrong. My next event rolls around, and despite my protests, I get in and swim. And man, I don't know what an alien chest burster really feels like, but man, it was close. I've never felt a worse pain than what I felt in that moment. After struggling to get out of the pool, I hobble my way over to the bleachers and just lay down. I can barely breathe. Every movement is excruciating, and I can barely walk. At this point, I can't take any more, and now finally my parents have caught on that this isn't just a pulled muscle. I scratch my remaining events, and my parents take me to the hospital. Turns out that I had ripped a hole in my lung and was lumping air into my chest cavity with each breath. The doctor said if I kept swimming, I would have collapsed a lung and drowned.